Welcome, fellow duelists. Let's journey together through the history of Yugioh,
It's time to duel!
where we shall look at the very best duelists to have ever picked up a deck.
Get your game on!
Different legends
Let's rev it up!
from different eras.
I'm feeling the flow!
A journey through time and space.
Ladies and gentlemen!
And every journey has a beginning.
Into the brains!
Long ago, when the pyramids were still young, Egyptian kings played a game of great and terrible power. But these shadow games erupted into a war that threatened to destroy the entire world, until a brave and powerful pharaoh locked the magic away, imprisoning it within the mystical Millennium Items. Now, 5,000 years later, a boy named Yugioh unlocks the secret of the Millennium Puzzle. He is infused with ancient magical energies, for destiny has chosen him to defend the world from the return of the Shadow Games, just as the brave Pharaoh did.
It's time to duel!
Welcome, one and all. More like a welcome back for me, honestly. I really miss making this kind of content, and what better way to return to it than telling you all about my hyperfixations? Today we're reaching far back in my childhood for something spicy. I've already done some content on this series before on my channel, but not ever in this manner. Today, my friends, we're destroying the moon! Covering Yugioh. You know, now that I think about it, are they really so different? Today, duelists, we will be talking about one of the pillars of the Yugioh franchise, the anime. As Yugioh is this unique franchise where each medium really is different enough from each other that even though they all center around the same large concepts, you have these large swaths of fans that are only fans of one or a few of these pillars. There are a number of folks who are a fan of everything Yugioh, but like certain parts of it more than others. And of course you have people who love everything in equal measure. And you have people who only watch the anime, or people who only play the card games, or people who only play the video games, or the manga, etc. For the purposes of clarity, this series is going to be 3 parts. First, and today's focus, is the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime and its many different series. Next will be the trading card game. This will be mostly a how to play video for people who have zero or minimal experience with the game itself. I'll be going over the different card types, the rules, and general tips on how to build a deck, with a few examples of decks that I like to run. Quick note, this isn't going to be a how to get into competitive video, as I'm not a competitive player. I'm more of a casually competitive. This is going to be more how to learn the game and get your foot in the door, although I will be linking various resources and other Yugi-tubers that can take you to that next step if you're willing. And finally, we'll be talking about the video games. This will encompass a brief history of the games of old, but will primarily focus on the 5 games that have either released recently or are going to release in the near future. With that out of the way, why don't we start where all good stories begin? 5,000 years ago, in a time of ancient pyramids at the Shadow Games. First, before we begin properly, I want to make the smallest of side notes to mention Season 0, because if I don't, I feel like I'll get some comments about it. Before Yu-Gi-Oh! Proper debuted on TV by Studio Gallop, there was a Season 0 of sorts, as dubbed by fans, that was done by Toei Animation. Both Season 0 and the Duel Monsters anime we know today adapt from the same material, but it's clear which one took off. It's an interesting watch, but for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to go into too much detail for it. Just like how I'm not going to go into too much detail on the manga itself, as I'm just not familiar with that pillar of the franchise, and I hope to eventually, but I feel like it wouldn't be right of me to be so thorough with something that I don't have first-hand knowledge of. Alright, now starting proper. Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, or as I'll refer to it from this point on to avoid confusion with future Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, Duel Monsters. It was an anime adapted from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga written by Kazuki Takahashi. This original anime was brought to us by Studio Gallop, who has worked on every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Series except for the most recent, Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s. This is for the Japanese release, of course, as English releases have been passed through quite the crazy path, but we'll get to that when the time's right. Duel Monsters came to us over here in the West on September 29th, 2001. I was 5 years old when the show came out, and deeply entrenched in the Pokemania of the late 90s. So, Yu-Gi-Oh! Slotted in real nice since it used to air either right before or right after Pokemon. My memory's a little bit foggy on that. Duel Monsters shares similarities with Pokemon in the fact that its first series was its most popular, and what helped it break out here in the West. But unlike Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has had a bit more of a drastic downturn in public presence after the original series had finished airing. This was due to in part of the following series all following new protagonists entirely, whereas Pokemon continued to follow Ash Ketchum. In the long run, I think that this is now to Yu-Gi-Oh!'s benefit as a show, but we'll get into that once we get to the other shows. Duel Monsters follows Yuki Moto, an extremely short, extremely spiky-haired boy who can be described as Marshmallow. He's got a kind heart, but I'm pretty sure if you poked him, he'd double over and start to deflate. First thing you notice about Yuki, outside of his hair, of course, that's going to be a running trend with Yu-Gi-Oh! Characters, is this little pyramid hanging around his neck. This is the Millennium Puzzle, an ancient Egyptian artifact given to him by his grandfather, an archaeologist who has long since retired and started up a game shop where Yuki stays. That's okay, because he's not alone. He attends school with his close group of friends, Taya Gardner, friendship is my true power personified, Joey Wheeler, hey, watch where you walk in here, and Tristan Taylor. Anyway, you start to see the dynamics of the group early on in the show. Joey's the hothead, frequently he butts heads with Tristan and Taya, and Tristan Tristan and Joey used to bully Yuki, going so far as to take a piece of his Millennium Puzzle before it was solved and throwing it into a canal. This dynamic between them changes when Tristan and Joey find themselves on the end of bullying themselves. Now, this character here is referred to as Tetsuo Ushio, but he reappears in a later Yu-Gi-Oh! Series with a localized name, Tetsuo Trudge. For consistency's sake, I'll be referring to him here as Trudge. Trudge beats up Joey and Tristan, and turns to Yugi, and jokes that he's going to collect a bodyguard fee. Yugi stands up to Trudge and calls them to his friends, and from that point onward, they begin to hang out. At school, Yugi is teaching Joey how to play Duel Monsters, the hit new game that's sweeping the nation. Now, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the trading card game is known as Duel Monsters. In our reality, it's known as Yu-Gi-Oh! You can use them interchangeably, but in the show, it's known as Duel Monsters. Weird. I know. Fun fact. Yu-Gi-Oh! Translates to King of Games, which here is the Yu-Gi-Oh! Equivalent to Pokemon Master. Yugi's grandfather runs a card shop as we mentioned earlier, and Duel Monsters is one of the games supported. Yugi tells Joey that he's got a rare Blue Eyes White Dragon card back at the shop, and invites his friends to go see it. Overhearing the conversation, we're introduced to Seto Kaiba. Seto is the CEO and lead designer of the worldwide corporation Kaiba Corp. He's a genius programmer and engineer and is rich beyond compare. He takes immediate interest in the rumor of a Blue Eyes White Dragon card. At Solomon Muto's game shop, Yugi introduces his new friends to his grandfather who shows off the rare card. Kaiba enters the scene and offers to buy the Blue Eyes off of Solomon, but he's denied as he says it's more valuable than any cost Kaiba could offer. Kaiba leaves frustrated, but he's not done yet. He orchestrates having Yugi's grandfather kidnapped and forces Yugi to meet up at his own personal stadium to duel for his grandfather's safety. Yugi, Taya, Joey, and Tristan arrive at the stadium, and Taya reinforces their bonds with markings drawn on each of their hands. Yugi steps up to the challenge against Kaiba using his grandfather's deck. Before the duel begins, the true mystery of Yugi's Millennium Puzzle becomes revealed. Yugi transforms, a spirit held within the puzzle enters Yugi's body. and begins to duel Kaiba. This duel is in Kaiba's favor as he summons 3 blue-eyes white dragons in one turn, and this brings me to a very important point we need to pause for. So, Yu-Gi-Oh! The anime helped spark the trading card game into being what it is today. But it's very important to note that the trading card game came out to the West almost halfway into the first season's debut into the West. By the time the card game had actually come to us, 19 episodes had aired internationally. The point I'm trying to make is that the first season of Duel Monsters, consisting of 40 episodes, does not follow the rules of the card game to a T. There were multiple instances of cheating as considered by the standards of the game nowadays, but it's because the actual game was not over here and developed by the time these episodes were written and dubbed. Japan has its own version of the trading card game traditionally called the OCG, or Original Card Game, but for the purposes of this video, that's neither here nor there. So, all of this to say, Kaiba shouldn't have been able to summon these dragons all in one turn, but screw the rules, he has money. Yugi's on his last draw, the odds are against him, but in the faith he places it in his grandfather's deck, he draws the one card he needs to win, the final piece of Exodia, the Forbidden One. With all 5 pieces gathered together in hand, Yugi, in this possessed state, follows through and removes the evil from Kaiba's heart. After this duel, he retreats inward, and word travels of this nobody kid defeating the dueling world champion Seto Kaiba. It travels to the creator of Duel Monsters, Maximilian Pegasus, of such an upset, and Pegasus begins to scheme. A tape is sent to the Muto household containing a message for Yugi himself, bringing him into a dark and mysterious shadow game. Yugi is challenged to a duel with a time limit. If he's unable to win, he shall forfeit his grandfather's soul. Unfortunately, Yugi is just barely not able to win, as the time limit ends just before he's about to call the deciding blow. Pegasus steals Yugi's grandfather's soul and seals it away inside a card, inviting Yugi to try to reclaim his soul by attending his personally hosted tournament on his private island, Duelist Kingdom. This sets forward the events of the rest of the season, and end our extremely detailed play-by-play of Duel Monsters. I will very quickly say that as the show goes on, it does improve a lot, and evolves as new characters are introduced. Yugi's own deck evolves, and larger and bigger threats threaten the world, the Battle City, Virtual World, Waking the Dragons, and the Grand Championship arcs. Of these seasons, I will say my personal favorite happens to be the Battle City arc, as the game gets fancy new redesigns, and we get to see a lot of the duels from Yugi, Kaiba, and even Joey, with new and growing aces and the introduction of the Egyptian God card plot. Plus, the duel of Yugi vs. Joey is a personal favorite. The first of 3 movies also takes place directly after the conclusion of the Battle City arc. This was a theatrically released movie called The Pyramid of Light. This is a story centered around Kaiba's increasing efforts to win in a duel against Yugi, more specifically the spirit that resides within the Millennium Puzzle, dubbed the Pharaoh, or Yami Yugi. He has a real name, but I'll save that for you to discover on your own. This movie centers around the Yugi vs. Kaiba conflict, but increasingly bears the fangs of an ancient Egyptian threat of a dead god Anubis. I highly recommend checking it out, as it has a lot of hype moments and is very nostalgic for me. And the soundtrack is full of bangers. The other 2 movies relate to Duel Monsters, but I'm going to wait on talking about the second movie Bonds Beyond Time until we're done talking about the third Yu-Gi-Oh series, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. The third Yu-Gi-Oh movie, though, Dark Side of Dimensions, is the series' 20th anniversary celebration. It takes place after the conclusion of the series and develops the characters further after the conclusive end of the show. I'm being a bit vague about this because I don't want to spoil the end of the show. I will say this is my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh movie of all time and is well worth the investment to get to it. Before we move on, I do want to comment on something that is a bit more minute compared to all the things surrounding it, but the three main characters we have dueling in this series are Yugi, Kaiba, and Joey. Other characters come in and leave and have duels every now and then, even if it's a very minuscule amount, but these three here are the main duelists we'll see regularly, so I want to highlight their decks for a quick moment. First of all, we have Yugi, or more accurately, we have Yami Yugi's deck, as late events of the show tend to have Yugi as a slightly different deck due to certain events, but for the ease of use, we'll just refer to this deck here as Yugi's deck. At the beginning of the show, this deck is a hot mess. Of course, it's related to that issue above about the trading card game not really being established yet. Everyone's deck early on was garbage, as a large majority of the cards were just bad. But we have a lot of normal monsters here with no secondary effects and stats that just aren't good. Of the cards he starts with, the only ones that could be considered okay even in this time he has are Mystical Elf and the Giant Soldier of Stone. And that's about it, until Dark Magician gets support later on, but only because they have high defense values. It isn't until Battle City and Yugi picks up a bit of his new cards like Dark Magician Girl and supporting skills for this Dark Magician archetype. This does elevate his ace monster into a bit of a usable state, but by the end of the show it's refined enough from what is used to include Magnet Warriors and even the Egyptian gods. Ranking Yugi's performance out of the total number of duels he had, Yugi's only had a 76% win-to-loss ratio. He's Yugi frickin' Moto, and he can only win 3/4 of the duels he's had? More like the king of lames. This trend follows through with Kaiba and Joey's decks, but they do split in opposite directions. Joey's deck early on is hot garbage, and there's literally no saving grace until the Battle City arc when he gets Jinzo. He does get a few new traps to spruce up his deck, but all in all it's a pretty weak deck overall. Joey's lost more duels than he's won, but only just barely. He's got a total of 48% of win/loss, which, yeah, makes sense. Kaiba, though, is seeing the most drastic upswing in usability as the series went on. First and foremost, his starter deck, like all of them, is pretty bad, but he's had a pretty healthy spread of offense and defense for what was available at the time. And as time went on, Blue Eyes only became better and better as an archetype. Of course, Kaiba wouldn't be around to see the absolute explosion of the Blue Eyes archetype that it would see in the 5Ds era, but that's a topic for the next video. Kaiba's win-to-loss ratio is 66%, as out of his 21 duels, he was able to win 14 of them. It may be less than Yugi, but protagonists are going to have their numbers higher than normal characters because they're the stars of the show. So having this high as a side character, that's really good. Moving forward, we're going to be switching over to the second Yu-Gi-Oh series, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, or Generation Next. This takes place about 10 years after the ending of Duel Monsters, and stars the new leading hero, Jaden Yuki, or in the Japanese version, Yuki Judai. From here on forward, GX has the most drastic name changes from the dub to the sub version, but I'm going to be using their English names because I just kind of prefer them. Real quick before we start this series though, I have to point out how spunky the opening theme is. It's exactly what you'd think an early 2000s kid show theme song would be.
Chilling out with the crew in the schoolyard, finding trouble, never looking too hard. Well, back at class, they never taught us this. Some things you gotta learn, hit or miss. Tough times, hard climbs, we'll take them on together. Right now, let's go! Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, Generation Next. Game on, get your game on.
I do have to give special attention though to the JP and Italian openings. They're really good too. Here's a small sample of each.
Yugioh, Yugioh, is your life just a game? Yugioh, Yugioh, la partita della vita è un duello senza appello. Scegli il campo e in un lampo le tue mosse e contromosse. Guarda in faccia la minaccia e stringi forte la tua sorte che fa parte delle carte. Just when I young, as you maintain no you may. 어이 지속해 keep holding on.手が届かなくて諦めかけてた broken dreams 置き去りの約束胸に刺さったまま抜けない君の言葉を
Jaden here is a hyperactive, spunky kid who tends to slacken his work, but more than makes up for his failings by bringing energy, a good attitude, and trust in his friends. The series begins with him being led to the entrance exam to enter Duel Academy, a school built around the honing of dual monster skills which was founded by Kaiba Corp. On the way, he bumps into a strapping young lad in ceremonial passing of the torch meeting. Quite literally so, as our previous protagonist, Yugimoto, gives Jaden a Wing Karibo card, a new version of a monster Yugi himself used quite a bit in the original show. But here, we get a glimpse of just how different this show is. Jaden begins to see the spirit of the Wing Karibo as if he were a guardian. It's a topic will get fleshed out over the season and the rest of the show, Jaden's ability to see and sense the dual spirits of certain cards. Making it to his entrance exam and just in time, he is met with Professor Crowler, a head teacher at Duel Academy's highest tier dorm who immediately dislikes Jaden's tardiness. He aims to teach Jaden a lesson by whooping the floor with him and barring his entry to the school. The two duel, and Jaden begins by showing off his archetype, the Elemental Heroes. I didn't explain this during Duel Monsters because the main character's archetypes tended to ebb and flow based on a few different kinds of specific monsters, since again the trade card game wasn't as established, so archetypes weren't similarly as established back then. Nowadays though, you'd be hard pressed to find a Yu-Gi-Oh character that wasn't built around a certain archetype. Jaden's Elemental Heroes are several comic book inspired heroes that can fuse together to create larger and grander heroes. In the beginning of the show, Jaden's ace monster is the elemental hero Flame Wingman, although by season 2 and beyond, it becomes elemental hero Neos. Jaden manages to summon Flame Wingman in this duel against Crowler and pulls out a win and placement among Duel Academy's ranks. However, due to his low score on the written tests, he's placed in the lowest tier dorm. Duel Academy is set up with 3 dorms with increasing level of prestige and honor, starting with the Slifer Red dorm, the Raw Yellows, and then topping off with the Obelisk Blues. Quite a Kaiba thing to do, honestly, to put the card that he had as the top rank. In the Slifer Red dorm, Jaden meets up with his 2 roommates, Cyrus Truesdale and Chumley Huffington, one of whom will actually go on to matter, but only barely. I may sound like I'm being a bit harsh, but it's only because I love GX. It's a tonally different yet similar show to Duel Monsters, and that may sound contradictory, but this show is set up quite differently. For the large majority of the show, it takes place in Duel Academy, so you're not seeing a lot of new locations constantly, and going on world travels like you did in Duel Monsters. So the tone early on is set up to be a bit more slice of life with everyday issues happening. For some, this may seem less focused, but I enjoy getting to see Jaden in company of react to various situations he's placed into. Come at the end of the first season, stakes do get raised a bit as other characters such as Bastard Misawa, Alexis and Atticus Rhodes, and Chaz Princeton come to take on the Shadow Riders, dark duelists who are aiming to revive the 3 sacred beasts, mythical monsters set to revival that of the Egyptian god cards. There's also a fantastic rivalry between Jaden and Cyrus's older brother, Zane Truesdale, and the threats only increase as Jaden is pitted against the Society of Light, the forces of the Dark World, and Yubel, and even the epitome of darkness itself. I will say the final 2 seasons of the show are totally different to the first 2, and are more in line with Duel Monsters. It takes itself more serious, more on this in a moment, and even going into the 4th season is some of the darkest Yugioh has been willing to go. Jaden goes through some shit, and he is one of my favorite characters because of it. That being said, I have 2 important things I need to discuss about this show if you're going to check it out. First and most important, the 4th and final season of this show was not dubbed in English. It's unfortunate, but 4Kids and Konami were going through some legal disputes during the dubbing of this show, and for whatever reason, the final season was left undubbed. So if you want the first 3 seasons dubbed, you will have to switch to subbed for the 4th and final season. It's pretty jarring, I will admit, but it is workable. I do recommend pushing past that feeling because season 4 is some of the greatest stuff in the entire series. And again, that opening song is really good. Second is that the English dub of this series is really something else. It's fully nostalgic for me, but it really goes ham in abridging itself. If any of you are familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX's dub is pretty much Yu-Gi-Oh! GX abridged by itself. There are dubbing decisions which do hamper the seriousness of certain scenes, but I don't think it fully ruins the enjoyment of them. It's a different kind of enjoyment. There's some really funny stuff here, as it constantly rags on itself and Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole. If you're looking for something that is more tonally balanced, I do recommend the sub version, but both are valid. Even though GX didn't introduce fusion summons to the series, it's definitely the one that focuses on them the most, and begins the trend of each new series highlighting a new summoning method that comes to the trading card game. Fun fact, there's a cancelled movie that was tooling around during the first year of GX's debut that would have crossed it over with the cast of Duel Monsters, titled Yu-Gi-Oh! Vs. GX. It was going to feature the cast of GX as they took a field trip to Domino City and encountered Yugi and Joey as the mysterious Sartorius Kumar plotted to defeat Yuki and other legendary duelists. As this movie fell to the wayside, ideas from it were repurposed into the Society of Light story arc from the 2nd season of GX, as Sartorius became a central character in the 2nd season of the show. Before moving on to the next show, we're going to run over very briefly the archetypes of the main characters of the show and their decks. Unlike Duel Monsters, we have a larger variety of duelists who duel regularly, so I'm going to breeze through them a bit faster. Starting off with Jaden, he begins the show running pure elemental heroes, which, while aesthetically pleasing, aren't really all that good in use, as they depend on you being able to pull the fusion cards, get their boss monsters out, and have the right materials in your hand. The boss monsters are pretty okay, but they're hard to get out since the materials are all rather weak on their own. Don't get me wrong, Jaden's deck is leagues better than Yugi at the start of Duel Monsters, but worse than his deck at the end of Duel Monsters. As time goes on, he adds a whole nother support archetype and the Neospatians into his arsenal, and even gets the new ace monster with Neos. But still, his deck is pretty lacking at this time, and like Yugi and Kaiba before him, elemental heroes would be given support later on that would much better improve their decks. It's just a shame Jaden wouldn't be able to take advantage of them. Throughout the series, Jaden takes part in about 95 duels, and he wins 78 of them. The other 17 duels are a mix of duels that end in no result, draws, and losses. So this leaves him with about 82% of his duels ending in victory. Next up we have Cyrus Truesdale, and he runs the Vehicroid monsters, mechanical monsters that like to quickly fuse together to make bigger bosses. Huh, that sounds familiar. Unfortunately, this deck kinda blows. Steamroid and Drillroid are pretty good, but would shine in a much better deck. Cyrus doesn't do all that often, but his win-to-loss ratio is about 55 to 45%, so immediately we see a drop in quality here, but he's still higher than Joey. Alexis Rhodes runs Cyber Angels, which I will say is a really good deck nowadays. It's unfortunate here she doesn't take advantage of all the cards that make it so. Like Cyrus, her win-to-loss ratio is a bit more split, although unlike him, she has a bit more not victories than victories. Zane Truesdale runs a Cyber Dragon deck, which is basically a better version of the Duel Monsters Blue Eyes White Dragon, but with the special ability to flood the field with monsters if your opponent controls monsters and you don't. Later on, he'd add the Cyber Dark monsters to this set and make his deck kinda worse, but overall, he has the best deck in the entire show, and his win rate's about 65% in his favor. So far, of course, he is higher than the previous, but considering he's not the protagonist, this is pretty respectable, and he is about the same as Kaiba is. Jesse Anderson is the final GX dual cell cover, as he becomes pretty prominent over the course of the 3rd season, and because I have a bit of a bias for him in his archetype, he uses crystal beasts that focus on sending monsters to the spell and trap card zone when they're destroyed that give you additional effects. While it's not a great deck, I'm going to be honest, I have a lot of fondness for it. Solid stats for the monsters, and it works pretty well in decks supporting the Sacred Beasts. His win rate's similar to Cyrus, about 55 to 45, as he's won 8 of the 15 duels he's been in, but think again, this was for only one season, so he does get a pass. Moving on from GX, Kazuki Takahashi has stated that he originally envisioned GX as the final Yu-Gi-Oh show, but around the end of 2006, the idea was proposed for our next stop on a retrospective journey, Yugioh 5Ds. So, I remember the title of this show being a huge point of contention for people when it first came out, but looking at it closer, it's not too hard to decipher. It comes from the 5 signer dragons that came from the main characters in the show, the 5 dragons, 5Ds. Since I've made it a habit now to talk about all the OPs, the English opening here, Hyperdrive, is really solid.
Going fast makes me feel alive. My heart beats in hyperdrive. Do you think you can win? Only if I lose. Just let destiny choose. I can hear you breathing. I can see you coming. I can feel the wind that's blowing me around. Take a shot at me, running side by side. It's a blur as I go by. I can hear you breathing. I can see you coming. I can feel the wind that's blowing me around. See the sun arise and fire in the sky. Greatness thrusts itself into our lives.
Of the original English openings, this one's my favorite, but I recently learned about the other openings that could have been the Season 1 theme, as 4Kids held a contest for users to vote on would be the final theme song. The others are kinda okay, but this one here, Ride to Survive, I think I love just as much.
Check it out. It's time to make a move. Never has a moment felt so right. No doubt. It's down to me and you. Moving faster than the speed of light. I can feel my engine pumping faster, faster. Raging with an appetite for turbo speed. I can't stop till you see what I got, 'cause I was born to be a winner. Take a good look, my game is off the hook, 'cause I am no beginner. Lean and mean, listen to my machine kicking into overdrive. We were born to ride. We ride to survive. Yeah!
The story begins sometime in the future of the previous 2 shows in New Domino City. This is the first Yu-Gi-Oh show that is more vaguely connected to the original timeline. We're not given a certain number of years, although we are still in the same continuity, as there are references which we'll go over. Our story stars Yusei Fudo. He's a noble and heroic young man who's proficient in dueling and riding, which is excellent because he's this world's many advancements in the dueling scene. New synchro monsters have exploded in popularity, which act like fusions between normal monsters and new, weaker tuner monsters, without the use of a spell card. This plus a new mobile version of dueling called Turbo Dueling, which duelists will race with specialized vehicles with dual discs embedded in their frame. Duels tend to play out much like on-foot duels, although a new mechanic known as speed spells exists, that allow the use of extra abilities based on the number of speed counters the duelist has. More in-depth discussions of this aren't needed to enjoy the show, but will be available in part 2 of the series for the trading card game. New Domino City isn't in a right state at the beginning of the series, as a portion of the population is segregated in what's known as the satellite, as being the lower quality of life for the poor and desperate. Yusei reveals early on that his old best friend, Jack Atlas, stole his first ever built duel runner and prize card Stardust Dragon in the duel. Jack used both to become the turbo dueling champion he is now and excels far beyond the status quo, whereas Yusei is relegated to the ghetto of the satellite. Yusei plans to break through into New Domino City in order to challenge Jack to a duel to reclaim what he'd lost, but he comes across Sector Security, a corrupt police force that is determined in keeping those in the satellite where they believe they belong. Leading the force is Tetsuo Trudge. Hey, wait a minute, we've seen this guy before. Yes, this is the same character as the bully from Duel Monsters, who was responsible for bullying Yugi, Tristan, and Joey, and bringing them together eventually. This means we're probably about 15 to 20 years in the future of Duel Monsters, but again, no exact time frame. Now, this might inspire excitement that we might see older Duel Monsters and even GX characters, but I'm gonna rip that band-aid off real quick. Trudge is the only character from a previous series that appears throughout the course of this show. Although there is a small reference to Joey Wheeler of all people right here with a character that's only known in the dub as Jesse Wheeler, Joey's cousin. In the original version, this character is not named and made directly connected to Joey, even if the design is apparently made to do so. Ooh, we got lost on a tangent there. But that's what the show is all about. Master Faster, dueling in hyperdrive. Now back to our story summary. Yusei's about to win out against Trudge, even though he tried to get the upper hand through underhanded means. Yusei makes it to the city interior and finds Jack and challenges him to a duel. Interested in the chance to duel once again, he accepts Yusei's offer, and the two face off in a secret duel in the Kaiba Dome. The two are evenly matched until both duelist dragons hit the field. Yusei has, at least temporarily, reclaimed control of his Stardust Dragon, while Jack pits it against his own Red Dragon Archfiend. During the clash, a bright red dragon interrupts their battle and knocks them both off of their duel runners. The duel ends with no clear victor, and Yusei and Jack both discover glowing red marks on each of their forearms. Before anything else though, Jack's manager and the head of Sector Security, Rex Goodwin, arrives on the scene with a slew of officers. Yusei is arrested and sentenced to be rehabilitated in a facility, a prison. Eventually, Goodwin would learn of Yusei's own mark and pull some strings to get Yusei sprung from this facility, after he proves himself of course, and enlists him in a plot to prevent the destruction of New Domino City by finding other duelists that are marked with the sign of the dragon. This includes finding other legendary duelists who command similar Dragon Ace monsters like Yusei's and Jack's. These eventually come to be Akiza Izinski, master of the Black Rose Dragon, and the twins Leo and Luna. And by the end of the first season, we get the true 5th signer in Crow Hogan, who very quickly becomes a mainstay in the series. Akiza is a duelist who can inflict physicality in her cards using her psychic abilities. There's a bit I want to talk about this in just a few seconds as it relates to our next topic, but first I want to say a little bit more about these characters. Throughout this season, Team 5Ds also befriends two important characters. One is Amnesiac, known only as Bruno, who strangely enough seems to moonlight as a mysterious figure named Visor, who teaches Yusei the secrets behind Excel Synchro Summoning, which, to simplify an already abstract concept, Excel Synchros are advanced synchro monsters that use a synchro monster and a second synchro monster that is also a tuner as its materials. It's basically a tier 2 synchro that's a pain in the ass to summon, but its effects are usually well worth the cost. And the other character is Sherry LeBlanc. She's a turbo duelist competing in the Grand Prix, who, like Time 5Ds, is looking to take down Iliaster to avenge her father. During a trip to the Moment Express Development Organization, Sherry gets sucked up into a wormhole and is lost for good. This all culminates in the revelation that the 3 emperors of Iliaster are actually all androids that represent 3 stages of their creator's life, Aporia. He reveals his 3 selves were sent back from the future that was destroyed by synchro summoning, and that he and his 3 cohorts, Iliaster's 4 stars of destruction, were behind the events of New Domino City's despair. Yusei duels Aporia in a final struggle for victory and uses the bonds with his friends to end the threat of Aporia, whose goal is to summon the Arc Cradle, a massive megalith that is going to crash into the current nuclear generator to cause a destruction event so catastrophic it would mean the end of everyone within a 30-mile radius. Yusei wins the duel and that's it. Everybody is saved. You certainly got a beginning, a bumpy middle, and an end. Sounds good, right? Yeah, well, if it actually ended here, it wouldn't be my favorite Yugioh show, It'd definitely be up there, but not my favorite. So, what did we miss? Oh boy. So, were you curious who this creator was? Or where Sherry went? Or where her arc resolution went? Or what the hell the point of Excel Synchro and Visor was? Or what about Aporia's 3 other cohorts that just never appeared? Do I have a story arc for you? But I'm gonna recommend you watch it for yourself because it is well worth the resolution and a very satisfying end to the arc. I will say though, the show covers 3 of the 4 stars of destruction. The 4th is mysteriously seen in a flashback in the future. Saying that out loud is kind of surreal. But he's never dueled by the main cast. I wonder if he'll become relevant soon. Oh well, before we go further onto that topic, I want to go over the characters, as we're finally over with the difficulties with the show. I will say, this is the last Yugioh show as a current writing that hasn't been fully dubbed, so from here on out, the English viewers will be able to get the full experience. Although, unfortunately, it isn't the last we'll hear of behind-the-scenes difficulties. So, characters! For the purpose of this video, I'll go over the cast of Team 5Ds. Pretty hardy collection of characters to go into detail with, I think. First off is Yusei Fudo. I'm not going to mince words, this is the best duelist out of the entire series, bar none. His deck is strategically sound and is a lot more defensive than Yuki or Jaiden's decks ever were. He has a healthy amount of traps at his disposal, and all of his monsters, while weak on their own, have a lot of effects to make them work together and to get out his ace, the Stardust Dragon. Throughout the course of the series, Yusei has only officially lost 1 duel, and that duel was the flashback duel where Yusei lost against Jack. Throughout the entire run in the series, Yusei either wins or does not finish every single duel he is in. The closest he comes is in the Season 1 duel against Callum Kessler as a Dark Signer, where he's about to lose but is unable to finish the duel. But aside from that, Yusei is just that good. This could be attributed to the fact that he's the oldest Yu-Gi-Oh protagonist has ever been, at 18 at the start of the series. Next up we have Jack Atlas, and over the course, he grows from a pompous and overly cocky duelist to a loyal friend and earns his attitude. His win rate, while not as high as Yusei's, is really quite commendable. Out of 45 duels over the course of the series, he's only lost 7 times, and didn't finish 5 duels after that. His total rate is 71%, and it's thanks to his powerful deck starring the Red Dragon Archfiend. His deck is tooled up for power and highly synchronizes with his fiery red attitude. Next, we'll tackle Leo and Luna. They don't see as much action as other duelists in the Team 5Ds because of their age, but it's really not anything special. Leo participates in 10 duels altogether, and he's only able to win 3 of them, so easy calculation, 30%. And the lowest of any main character so far. Utilizes the Morphtronic archetype, and yeah, it's just kind of there, nothing too special. Luna may have more plot relevance of being a signer for much longer than her brother, but she only duels in 6 duels across the whole series, and only wins 2 of them. So even though she won less duels than Leo, because of her total amount of duels, her total win rate is 33%. Next up is Kiza, because we go back to the High Rulers. She runs a plant deck which headlines the Black Rose Dragon. She duels 15 times over the course of the series, and ends up winning 7 of them confirmed. There are 2 duels that were not shown the result of through flashbacks, so for the purpose of this ranking, I'm not going to count them the final percentage. So out of 13 duels, she's won 7, which is 53%. And finally, we have Crow Hogan. Crow's an odd case. His entrance into the show as a tritagonist alongside Jack and Yusei was directly in part due to a few factors. 1, the previously mentioned psychic sex nonsense that shelved Kiza's development had affected her time as a main character. And 2, Crow was initially designed to be the final Dark Signer for the end of the first season, but the plans radically changed when his archetype, Blackwings, reached shores of the TCG. They exploded in popularity, and the showrunners decided they hadn't seen support for a new archetype so quickly before, so they decided to change Crow's role. And since Akiza had left sort of void in Team 5Ds, Crow fit in nicely. He becomes a signer, and his Blackwing Dragon is retroactively made into a signer dragon. And definitely so fits because his Blackwing deck is one of the most known archetypes from 5Ds as a whole. Out of the 25 duels Crow had, 10 more duels than Akiza ever had, and he came in later than she did. Crow won 19 of them. and of these 6 that he didn't win, he only outright lost 3 of them. So his total win percentage is 76%. Dude's the second highest win percentage in the entire show because his deck's so OP. Now, with the conclusion of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, we're moving on to the next series, Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal, right? Nope, because we have the final Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie to talk about. Releasing in America in February 2011, about 2 months before the next show dropped in Japan, and about 7 months before we get to see Zexal for the first time, Yu-Gi-Oh! Bonds Beyond Time is a 3D crossover film that contains the heroes of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Duel Monsters, GX, and 5Ds. I remember when this film was announced, it hyped up every living molecule inside my being. This was a dream film. I wasn't able to see this one in theaters, the only movie I wasn't to in this series, but I still heavily enjoyed it. Although, upon learning it was only 50 minutes long, basically the length of an episode and a half, it did take some wind out of the sails. It's a bit of a shame though, because it basically boils down to a short introduction sequence for each of the 3 protagonists and then a single duel. But, you know, with my minor gripes about the length are over, this is awesome. First, I'm going to place where this movie takes place in the context of each series, as this movie is like 98% canon to each of them, but we'll get into that now. For Yusei and Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, this takes place between episodes 82 and 86, as they need to have met Bruno, but not yet experienced the Crash Town arc. For Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, this takes place after the end of the show, including Jaden's final duel. And finally, for Duel Monsters, it's a little stickier, as Yugi is shown to be taller here, so we assume he's older than the events of the original show. But for certain events regarding the end of the show, this can't be directly after. So we'll tentatively put this sometime during the Awakening of the Dragons arc. Also, Pegasus cameos in this movie, but he seems to still have a Millennium Eye, which he shouldn't have. So this feels more like an animation error than anything, but I just wanted to point it out. You know, I could let you watch the movie for yourself and skip on describing the plot like the other two just so you can get a genuine first-time viewing, but I figure I want to at least cover one of the movies here, and this one seems to be the best one to do so. Yeah, I could go on a long-winded, detailed process about the intricacies of the plot, but honestly, we both know how long this video is. I'm gonna let Shady Box take it over.
If you try to duel me, it's gonna make me stronger. I need you to play a card now, cause I can't wait much longer. My deck's like totally gonna beat ya. You may think you're harder, but just wait for when I make my next move, when Kariba's coming at ya. Yo, listen up, homeboy, let me be the tutor. About to tell you all about how we saved the future. I started out with Jade and Yuki hanging out in Venice. Last thing I knew, Crowler had me playing tennis, and this guy rolls up on his motorcycle. He's got a freaky ass mask like that Myers named Michael. He's trying to kill me, man, for all he's worth, shouting out this weird crap about saving the earth. And then he revs up his bike, he's got the need for speed. It's a good thing I played all that Assassin's Creed, but then the sky turned black. Out comes this huge dragon, the thing 5 times the size of a station wagon, is in hot pursuit, shooting fireballs, got me jumping the roofs and got me climbing the walls. I tried to escape, but at the very last minute I whipped out my duel disc and I push it to the limit, saying if you try to duel me, it's gonna make me stronger. I need you to play a card now, cause I can't wait much longer. My deck's like totally gonna beat ya. You may think you're harder, but just wait for when I make my next move, when Kariba's coming at ya. Well, as it turns out now, I'm not the first sucker who's had a run-in with this masked motherfucker. For now, we gotta skip 100 years or 3, cause the story ain't told chronologically. But hey, don't get confused, understanding's a breeze. This action takes place in the world of 5Ds. Yusei and his friends were just driving around when guess who shows up with an evil sound? He steals Yusei's dragon, and then he takes off bragging. Yusei's tattoo glows, it somehow knows how to travel through time, and I can hear you whine, but don't you fret, cause things about to get. If you try to duel me, it's gonna make me stronger. I need you to play a card now, cause I can't wait Kansas, we ain't Dorothy and Toto. When all of a sudden, here comes Yugimoto. We team up together, an unstoppable force. We gotta challenge Paradox, and we'll win, of course. We take the guy down and we save our show. Ain't no one gonna mess with Yu-Gi-Oh! Yeah! If you try to duel me, it's gonna make me stronger. I need you to play a card now, cause I can't wait much longer. My deck's like totally gonna beat ya. You may think you're harder, but just wait for when I make my next move. When Karibo's coming at ya. Get your game on! Yo, Jin and Yuki, 2017. Hey yo, where the f are my Cheetos at?
So there's a few things to unpack here. Getting to see Jaden in a post-season 4 light in English is so cool, and it's not the last time I'm gonna gush about that, I promise you. But getting to see references to Jesse and Zane as well, and Kaiba and Joey was real nice through their monsters. And hey, here's a Paradox! He's the 4th star Billyester that we never saw on the show, so this is what he was up to. It's just a shame the English audience had no idea who this was, because the storyline revealing who he was wasn't ever dubbed. Alright, so with this aside, we truly now are finished with Yugioh 5Ds. It's not a perfect show, it bears its flaws pretty obliquely on the surface, and Lord knows the fandom will not let you forget how much they dislike the idea of card games on motorcycles.
Bro, did you hear that? Card games on motorcycles!
Card games on motorcycles.
Card games on motorcycles.
Card game on motorcycles!
Card games on motorcycles!
Card games on motorcycles!
Card games on motorcycles.
The resulting carnage lasted for at least 5 hours, and unfortunately there were no survivors. Oh, this just in. Card games on motorcycles!
Card games on motorcycles!
Card games on motorcycles!
But at the end of the day, what it does from beginning to end, it shows a lot of heart, and it goes into a lot of dark places and shows a more mature side of the franchise that we hadn't seen before. The opening theme is the best in the series, yes, even better than Duel Monsters, literally duel me on this. Yusei is the perfect amount of stoic and caring to avoid being cliche. He just genuinely cares for his friends and for what's right, and god damn it, he enjoys his milk. A soundtrack of pure flames and the best villains in the series, all packaged together with duelists who have decks that actually focus on strategy and playing the card game instead of plot armor. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds is something really special, and I love that more and more people nowadays are seeing its high points. Now, we get to move to the series' low point. At least, everyone who began to watch the next series would say. Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal dropped over here in the West, not by 4Kids. The end result of all but the lawsuit, Konami was taking over the license for Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal's production. But, technically it wasn't an immediate process. 4Kids did begin the dub, and continued until episode 41, and that was when it was transferred in full to Konami directly, and then 4Kids declared bankruptcy. Rest in peace, Fallen King, until they came back under the name 4 Entertainment 5 years later, and then almost immediately declared bankruptcy again. Major Umfi's comrade. Anyway, Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal, like 5Ds, be introduced to a new method of summoning, Xyz summoning, which takes similarly leveled monsters and overlays them to create a boss monster. These differ from synchro monsters as you're not adding the 2 levels up, but instead taking, for example, 2 level 4 monsters to create a new monster that is rank 4. That's the basic premise, and we'll go over it in more detail in the next part, so don't worry right now if it's a little confusing. In short, you're basically making pairs. We begin with Yuma Tsukumo, who, I'm not going to mince words, this is my least favorite Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonist, and based on my initial experience with Zexal, the difference was by far. To begin, I will say that Zexal is the point where I initially dropped off of Yu-Gi-Oh! I didn't enjoy the beginning, and finding it on TV was harder than any of the other shows, as they changed stations, so when I finally started rewatching Yu-Gi-Oh! Series in about 2016, I gave the first 20 episodes a try, and I just didn't like it. I considered it the odd one out, because where the next few shows came out, I enjoyed them a whole lot more, and to me, that was fine. I didn't have to like every Yu-Gi-Oh show, especially since at this time there were now 4 to choose from. However, like a mouse in the night, rumblings of people crossed my ears. Rumblings of people swearing that they knew Zexal's beginning was bad, but if he stuck through it, he became really good, possibly even being the best. Now, I was suspicious. Is that really possible? In truth, Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal shares a lot of things with GX, and this is the key to understanding Zexal. You see, I was coming off of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, a more gritty and serious show with a lot older cast, going to a more fun and zany and wacky adventure with a dumb kid protagonist who doesn't like school and would rather have fun. Hey, wait a minute, this is just Jaden. So, I joke, but this is where we establish a pattern here with Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, and we as viewers have to manage our own expectations. We have now alternated back and forth between more serious shows and more laid-back shows. More serious show, more laid-back show. It isn't going to immediately continue in the same exact pattern, but now we know enough data to know that there are 2 kinds of Yu-Gi-Oh! Shows. And we can't fault the more laid-back ones for not being as serious and vice versa, but instead judge them for what they are. So, going to the beginning of Zexal with this new mindset, is the beginning any good? No. I'm still going to be frank. The first 20 or so episodes are, well, they're not great. Beginning plot introduces us to Yuma and his partner Astral, a being from another dimension who acts only on logic, but who has also lost all of his memories. They are scattered across 100 number cards that Yuma and Astral must recollect to recomplete his memory. If any of this is sounding familiar, it's basically the Yugi/Pharaoh relationship with a set number on it. And if the show kept to this exact formula for the first 20 episodes, I surely would rank it as the absolute lowest by no sharp margin. However, I will echo the opinion that it does get better and doesn't wholly stick to this formula. So here, for side characters, the only one outside of Yuma that really matters is Shark, whose real name is Reginald Castle. He's the local bully at the start of the show, but does grow over the course, and as his insecurities are tested, more about him is revealed. There are other side characters here, even one voiced by Sean Schemmel. But man, they just don't matter. I will say this definitely contributed to just how disinterested I was in the show initially, because the only characters I actually liked were Astral and Shark, and Astral himself doesn't duel, at least in the start, but simply tells Yuma what a bad duelist he is, and oh boy, Yuma is a bad duelist to begin. Shortly after this point though, we get introduced to a few new characters, and each of them brought intrigue and hooked me into the series for good. First off is Kite Tenjo, who from this point on I'm going to refer to his Japanese name Kaito, because it's just my personal preference for him and him alone. He is my favorite character in the show, by the way. Kaito is a number hunter, and he has this eerie ability to stop time, which isn't ever really brought up again after this point, and he's just cool. Then we're introduced to 3 brothers and a mysterious villain. The brothers, Trey, Quattro, and Quentin, are all jelly beans, and I love them. Because they're villains, but because they're villains by circumstance. They believe the actions they're taking are the best because they're loyal to their father. Yes, this is their father, dimensional shenanigans are involved. But Vetrix here, we learn, used to be friends with both Yuma and Kaito's fathers, until Kaito's father, Dr. Faker, another major antagonist, betrayed them both. So throughout the initial number hunting plotline, we quickly get revealed a story about a conflict between 3 men that bleeds through their children, the bonds that form from that conflict. And suddenly, the Yu-Gi-Oh! I loved was here all along. And this is just season 1. Oh boy! Zexal does this weird thing where the second season was kind of referred to as its own show, Zexal 2. This season is nuts. I literally cannot spoil a single thing about this season, but I will give my highest regard that you should definitely check this out. And where I previously thought that Zexal was the worst show by far, the second half of Zexal 1 slots it about the same as Duel Monsters but below GX and 5Ds. Zexal 2, however, puts it quality-wise at the top. 5Ds is still my favorite show up to this point, but its production issues and drop threads definitely do have to be taken into consideration. Yuma grows into a duelist who can stand on his own, and he doesn't have to rely on Astral to just barely get by. They become an actual team. Kaito gets a lot of screen time, and his monsters look so cool. every time I look, it just unlocks something deeper than me. Shark. Oh boy, do not Google anything about Shark. There were spoils aplenty. Let me do you this favor, don't Google anything. There's this character named Ray Shadows who's also really awesome. Also, don't Google anything about him either if you want to go in blind. The final duel is batshit insane. I am recommending you go watch the show immediately. Now, for character summaries to begin, we start with Yuma himself. I'm not going to be soft on this one. Yuma is a hard barrier of entry for the show. His voice isn't pleasing to listen to, and watching someone be bad at dueling for so long really belies the greatness that comes out of this show. It takes quite some time to get used to Yuma, but when he does settle in, it's much easier to get used to enjoying the rest of the show. Yuma's the first protagonist to use exactly 0 normal monsters, and honestly his deck is a lot better for it. He runs an Automatopoeia deck, so he has monsters that have names like Ga Magician and Go Golem in it. Get it? Makes a funny sound. His ace is really good though. Number 39, Utopia. It's an Xyz monster, so it just needs 2 of Yuma's many level 4 monsters to come out. And its effect lets you discard one of the monsters that were used to summon it to stop a battle. And with 2 monsters needing to be used to summon it, it has this effect twice. It's really good protection if the enemy can get the upper hand. However, with such a good deck, Yuma's poor skill at the beginning of the series really shows, and it's not just cards that lead to victory. Throughout the series, Yuma's dueled 94 times. Out of those duels, he's won 51. Yuma has the lowest win rate percentage at 54% out of any of the past and future protagonists. I will say 19 of these losses are in flashbacks early on in the series. If we take those out of the equation, and his win rate climbs up to 68, it's still the lowest out of all the protagonists we've seen thus far, and if we remember, the next highest was Yuki with 76%. Next up is Shark. He runs a deck based around sharks. Shark has dueled 32 times and has won 24 of them, with 2 duels ending in no result, meaning he has a 75% win rate. Again, for a rival, this is really good. Moving on over to Kaito, the best boy, he's running a Photon deck that stars his Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon. Kaito was the first duelist to iterate off of Kaiba's Blue Eyes in the sense that it's now become a pattern that there are more blank eyes, blank dragons out there, and Galaxy Eyes here is the start to it all. Also, can I just take another second to gush over how cool this monster is? Anyhow, back to the topic. Kaito has only dueled 22 times over the course of the series, but he won 15 of those duels, and not one of them was shown the result of. 3 were draws and 3 were losses. Note though, that none of these losses were ever to Yuma. Yeah, that's right. Kaito is the first and only rival to never lose a duel to the main protagonist. That's how cool Kaito is. His win rate is 68%. Again, still good for a rival, and sad that it's tied for the protagonist of the show, with less than a third of the duels. Now, we're going to move 4 years into the future, as the 5th Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, titled Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5, arrives on the Western Shores on July 24th, 2015. Although it's to be noted it came out in America almost half a year later, this show is definitely the strangest out of all the Yu-Gi-Oh! Shows before and after. It's just crazy. So, before we get into the actual synopsis, I'm going to say this show reminds me a lot of the DC Comics crossover event Crisis on Infinite Earths. For those of you who know what I mean, yeah, we're going there. And for those who don't, let's get into it. We begin with a new protagonist, Yuya Sakaki. He wishes to be a duel tainer, which is a duelist who puts on a performance during the new action duels, which are sort of crosses with obstacle courses. Action duels do not exist in the TCG, so I'll briefly go over it here. When 2 duelists duel, normally they stand still or ride a D-wheel around a racetrack in a turbo duel. Here, the urge to be mobile and fast on their feet, as spread around the arena, are action cards, which have a variety of effects to protect the user and harm the opponent if they can reach him before the other. It's basically plot armor to extend or end a duel whenever the writers wish without needing to be duel specific. Yugi is a fun-loving boy who isn't too caught up in the studies of his class and, hey, wait a minute, I've seen this twice before now. Okay, put down your pitchforks. I know on the surface, Yuya seems like an exact Yuma clone, but in reality he's a lot better than Yuma. I like Yuya quite a bit. He's a fun guy who duels to make other people smile. He looks up to his father, who is a legendary duel tainer, And you just love seeing this boy smile, man. Also, he created our new summoning technique. Oh, are you not surprised? Yeah, so Yugioh's father left him a pendulum, something he keeps with him at all times. And one day while dueling 3 of his effects monsters, Stargazer Magician, Time Gazer Magician, and Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon into what are known as pendulum monsters. Pendulum summoning is... well, it's definitely the most controversial summoning method of any in the entire series. I'll admit they're my least favorite, but I've grown to like them over time. So basically, you have these specific monsters that look like this. You may have seen one of these cards in the memes that joke about how Yu-Gi-Oh cards have 1,000,000 words per card on it. So here's how they break down. These cards are basically half a monster card and half a spell card, but they're not both at the same time. It is either a monster or a spell based on how you choose to summon it. If you summon it like a normal monster, you ignore this box up here and treat it like an effect monster by reading this effect. If you decide to use its other effect, you do what's called setting the pendulum scale. I'll go over more specifics on how it works in either duel formats in later videos in the series, but for normal duels, you'd set them in specific zones near your other spell and trap cards. These indicators here are the scale number, and if you set 2 monsters in the pendulum zone, you can freely summon out monsters whose levels are between the numbers of your scales. Also, this means that you can ignore this box here, and only go off of this one up here. Yugioh gains notoriety for the Yugioh Duel School as hosting the creator of this brand new and exciting summoning method, but funnily enough, during his opening duel with the leading lady of the series, Zuzu Boyle, Yugioh actually ends up losing. This is the first time that the main protagonist ends up losing to the lead female character, and as such, I will say that Zuzu is one of the stronger females in the series. Word of Yugioh's exploits reached Declan Akaba, the poster boy of the Leo Institute of Dueling. Declan is a lot like Kaiba on the surface. He's confident and stoic and is CEO of his family company. Declan organizes a duel with Yugioh to learn how he is able to pendulum summon. After gathering the necessary data, he lets Yugioh win the duel and uses the information to produce his own pendulum cards. The second duelist to successfully pendulum summon is a Leo Institute student named Silvio Sawatari. He's got this Chaz Princeton energy about him where he's initially a cocky bully to Yugioh, but after suffering defeat, he mellows out a bit. Now, all this seems par for the course for a Yu-Gi-Oh show. Nothing too crazy, pretty safe. What's this show's gimmick, huh? Interdimensional war. Yep. So, in Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5, there are 4 distinct dimensions based mostly on previous Yu-Gi-Oh! shows. I'll accept Duel Monsters because Arc 5's main dimension is a stand-in for Duel Monsters. But let's go through this. Standard Dimension contains our heroes we've explained thus far, and starring our boy Yuya Sakaki, who develops pendulum summoning. Fusion Dimension. Duelists at Duel Academy learn the arts of fusion summoning. It involves a similarly named boy named Yuri, and a few alternate universe versions of some characters from Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, like Alexis Rhodes and Astra Phoenix. Synchro Dimension. Duelists at New Domino City turbo duel with their synchro summons to escape the oppression of class warfare as an alternate dimension version of Jack, Atlas, and Crow Hogan appear alongside a new boy, Yugioh. Xyz Dimension. Duelists from Heartland City focus on the Xyz summoning and oncoming invasions from the Fusion Dimension. New duelists Shay, Obsidian, and Yuto lead the cause as they spill over into the Standard Dimension. Also, Kaito appears in this show, because he's so cool! Yes, you guessed that right. Yugioh here has some dimensional alternates that seem to originate from their respective dimensions. He's not the only one though, because Zuzu also has some counterparts in Selena, Rin, and Lulu from their respective dimensions. The basic gist of the story at this point is Yugioh joining up with the group named the Lancers to protect other dimensions from the invasion of the Fusion Dimension and the Wrath of Duel Academy. There's a lot I'm glossing over here, and a finale that may etch as the top of the series. But man, the ideas they had with the series went balls to the wall, and the effort they took with it just amazed me. Unfortunately, it's not executed absolutely perfectly, as there were quite a few behind-the-scenes production issues that caused the group's stay in the Synchro Dimension to last a little longer than expected. This part of the show is a little bit of a pace breaker, but for me it does pick back up. Certainly a wild improvement over the beginning of Sexual, although it does take just a little bit for these dimension aspects to come into play, but for here I think it works for the show's credit. Now, starting off with Yugioh as a duelist, I will say his deck is quite good. There are quite a few Performapal cards that are absolutely broken for how overpowered they are. I will say Yugioh's deck is definitely one that changes the most over the course of the series, as his Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon has more forms than the number of words on Endymion, the Mighty Master of Magic. Bam! Smooth segue! Pendulum monsters, fusion monsters, Xyz monsters, synchro monsters. It's a one-size-fits-all dragon. I'm not going to spoil the end of this show, but I will say really quick that there's something about Yugi's first duel here with Zuzu. It's really cool if you know your Yu-Gi-Oh history and how the show ends. I really wish I could gush about it here, but you'll know what I mean if you pay enough attention on your watch-throughs. Yugioh dueled a total of 56 times and won 40 of his duels, leaving his overall percentage at 71%. It may seem rather low for a protagonist, but he's only full-on lost 4 duels out of 56. The rest are largely duels that ended in no result, and if we took those out of the equation, then he's up there with a solid 92% win rating, which obviously beats out everyone except for Yusei. Moving on over to Zuzu, she builds the Melodious monsters. Her early mastery over the fusion summoning mechanic lends well to her deck as her archetype excels with fusions. She's dueled 11 times over the course of the series and has won 5 of them, outright lost 3, and no result with the remaining 3. If we're counting the no results duels, she has a 45% win rate, which is just under Akiza, but if we're not counting those, then she's up at 62%, the highest female lead. Declan Akaba runs a DDD deck, which stands for Different Dimension Daemon. Hitting the nail a little too much on the head there, Declan. Declan utilizes not only Pendulum monsters, but also Synchro, Fusion, and Xyz monsters, and his deck is also pretty good. Interestingly enough, Declan is the first main rival whose ace isn't a dragon. He dueled a total of 15 times across the series and won 9 of those duels. Lost 3 duels, and 3 ended in no result. If we count everything together, his win rate is 60%. However, if we don't, then it's 75%. There are a lot of duelists in this show that only stick around for certain arcs of the show, so I'll leave the other you boys to your viewing experience. Moving forward 2 years, we get our first Yu-Gi-Oh show in the style of 5Ds in quite some time. Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains, released in the West on September 1st, 2018. The name of the show comes from 3 abbreviations: VR, AI, and NS, being virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and network system. So, Vrains. This series is something. I think that this has really had the chance to up everything that 5Ds established in an older Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonist, but it seems like these styles of shows tend to attract development issues. Before we go into the show proper, I do have to mention this is the shortest Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, having only 3 seasons. There are threads that get dropped as the show progresses, and it's really quite a shame, especially when there are quite a few recap episodes that don't further the plot, as crunch culture was a widely reported issue that Studio Gallop underwent with this series, writing up recap episodes so they could have time to work on the actual progress episodes, so they wouldn't have to go on hiatus. My heart goes out to the animators of Studio Gallop, because it really does seem like this show is a death knell for them, seeing as it's the last time they ever worked on Yu-Gi-Oh! Studio Bridge takes over for the next and current season. With that out of the way, I want to get to the good. So we start off with Yusaku Fukiji, a high school student with moonlights online as the famed Link Vrains player, Playmaker. Link Vrains is a massive VR network, not unlike an MMO. Yusaku is definitely a bit more reserved than Clyde as a protagonist. He's a hacker and prefers to not stick out. Similar to Yusei, Yusaku is high school aged, and he ends up facing up to the Knights of Hanoi, an opposing hacker group and mutual threat against the developers of Link Vrains, Soltech, who, interestingly enough, does show a darker side to them when it concerns different AI programs that are called the Ignis. 6 AI with free will that were designed to live in a virtual space called Cyber's World. In a confrontation with the Knights of Hanoi, Yusaku comes across one of the Ignis and captures it, knowing if the Knights are after it, it must be something to protect. So now we have the setup. Soltech and the Knights of Hanoi are after the Ignis, and for an unknown reason, and Yusaku is at the center of it all with the rivalry of the Knights and now Soltech on his trail. Yusaku begins to partner with the Ignis, dubbed I, although hesitantly at first, but he proves to be quite helpful in battle. So, I have to talk about Link summons here now. This is a little bit easier of a concept than pendulums were, because for all intents and purposes, they're like Xyz monsters' long-lost cousins. Now, I know here this looks confusing, but let's break it down. So, summoning Link monsters here in a lot of situations is almost identical to Xyz summoning. However, instead of using its levels, it depends on the kind of monsters. So, it could be 2 monsters that have an effect, it could be 2 monsters of the Cybers archetype. It's a bit more free and open for different kinds of decks. And second, these monsters don't have a defense value, so they can't be placed in defense mode. And finally, the arrows. So, Link monsters have different tiers to them based on the number of arrows that are present on the card. And you need to link Link monsters of lower links to get the stronger, higher links. The arrows directly correspond to the number of materials needed to summon it. Since they have link ratings, they do not have a level or a rank, meaning they can't be used to Xyz or synchro summon other monsters. And spell or traps that affect monsters with a level or rank do not affect them. And finally, the bonus effects that they give off will affect the monster cards that are in the zones on the field that the arrows point to. This can be for buffs for your cards or nerfs for your opponent cards. So, it may not seem from my summary thus far that there are a lot of characters within the world of Brains, but it's largely because I wanted to save them for the duelist summary, as Yugioh as a protagonist is definitely the most removed from the bonds of friendship thus far. He grows to trust and have friends over the course of the series, definitely, but a lot of it happens later on, and surround details that I'd rather not spoil here. So, starting off with Yugioh, he runs a Cybers deck with a few different notable ace cards. Starting off, we have the Code Talker and Decode Talker Link monsters. With the traditional 2500 attack, Ace is his Firewall Dragon. And oh boy, this monster caused quite the havoc in the TCG so hard, it actually got banned for a while before they made a version of it that wasn't so broken. His deck is really solid, and the strategies he employs throughout the series would make Yugi shit his leather pants. Yugioh was dueled 56 times over the course of the series and has won 53 of those duels. And he was in 3 duels that ended in a draw. This means that Yugioh has a 94% win rate. That is insane! Next up is Aoi Zaizen, otherwise known in Link Brains as the Blue Angel. Aoi has a bubbly personality and doesn't mesh well with Yugioh's more reserved tendencies. The two have allied with each other on numerous occasions, but this is the first main tag lead female relationship that isn't a close friendship. She starts off the series with a Trickstar deck that leads later on into using a Marincess deck. Both of these are really solid and follow the trend of following archetypes for very specific strategies. She dueled 10 times over the course of the series and is sitting at a solid 50% win rate. Moving forward, we have Aobesso, otherwise known as Ghost Girl in Link Brains. She's a mercenary hacker. Money talks for her, and whoever is willing to pay, she's willing to work for. Although she does take an interest in Yugioh after dueling him. She runs an Altergeist deck, which is really solid. It's built around having a lot of traps and monsters with a lot of negative effects for your opponents. However, for how good her deck is, of the 5 duels she's had throughout the series, she only wins once. For our final character summary, we have Varus, or Revolver in the Japanese version. Knowing this guy's archetype is various firearm terminology, it's not hard to see that these monsters, and even his name, were censored in the dub. He runs a Dark Dragon deck, which runs a lot of Bullet and Verilode monsters, and his ace is the Verilode Dragon, although he does have Fusion, Xyz, and Synchro variants for when the situation calls for it. He's dueled 13 times over the course of the series, one being a no result end, so we'll take that out of the equation, and he's won 6 times, so he's got a 50% win rate. He's only lost 4 of the 6 remaining duels, and then the 2 remaining in the draw. With this, Brains is a good show. I like it a lot. But we have the reality that it deserved a lot more, and the animators deserved a lot more. It's a shame that we totally could have had a final season or 2 to fully wrap up some of the storylines here. But at the end of the day, I'm glad that we did get what we did. So, we're here at the end. Our final show for the purposes of this discussion. This next show is our final, and as of right now, unfinished Yugioh series. As of yet, we do not have an English dub, although it's heavily implied to be kind. Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s came out on April 4th, 2020 in Japan, and stars Yuga Odo. So far, Yuga is our youngest protagonist, as he's stated to be only in the 5th grade, making him about 11 years old. This seems to be a more lighthearted story, just to start, similar in the vein to GX and Sexel. Goha City, a relatively close future, is governed by the Goha Corp, which rules everything from schooling to dueling regulation, even to the clothing and shelter to its city citizens. Yugioh is a mechanic and free thinker, so naturally he's going to clash with this invasive environment. So the new dueling mechanics in this show are interesting. We have a new method of dueling called rush duels. So this duel uses a reduced field of 3 monster and spell zones similar to speed duels, and I'll go over those in more detail in the next video, I promise. For rush duels, the player can summon as many level 4 and below monsters as they want. Higher level monsters must be tribute summoned like normal. On the draw phase, players will draw until they have 5 cards, and if they have 5 or more, then they only draw 1. There is no limit to the number of cards in their hand, and running out of cards in the deck during a draw phase results in no loss still. And the big change from speed duels, legend cards. This is effectively an ace card that the deck is usually built around. They are either iconic cards or cards that are good enough to earn the status, and there can only be a single legend card in a player's deck. And finally, maximum summons. So, maximum summons are multi-part kaiju monsters that can utilize multiple effects of all of its pieces. Maximum pieces will have the central unit, and then 2 side pieces. They share the same name of the central monster, but will have an R or L in the name to denote the right or left side piece. The side pieces can be used as singular monsters by themselves, so they have their own attack and defense value, but when the central monster is maximum summoned, you only go off the central piece's values. You can think of maximum summons like how Yugioh worked back in Duel Monsters. 5 separate pieces for 1 monster, however instead of 5 it's 3, and instead of insta-win you get a beefy monster with multiple effects. With that out of the way, I'm going to do a much smaller story synopsis since this show is still ongoing, and because I myself have only seen a few episodes, so I don't want to report on what I haven't seen myself yet. So, Yugioh early on is shown to be rebellious against the authority placed on him by the penalties placed on his dueling account because of his attempts to hack into his duel disk to install rush duel system. This is similar to both Yusei and his skill with engineering, and Yugioh with his desire to invent a new dueling style, rush dueling for Yugioh, and pendulum summoning for Yugioh. Yugioh is friends with a spiky blue-haired boy nicknamed Luke. His real name is Tatsuhisa Kamijo. He aims to be the #1 duelist and has taken an extreme interest in Yugioh's rush duel system, and by association, distrusts Goha Corp for the risk they pose in shutting down rush duels. Early on, Yugioh and Luke are led to a mysterious cave with an equally mysterious monument that displays a mysterious hologram man who baits the boys into a rush duel to test them to see if they're worthy of being the King of Duels. In the duel, the hologram man summons the legendary Blue Eyes White Dragon. And that's where the story synopsis will end right here, as it leads into the rest of the story. Finally, I want to go over some of the other characters that come to meet in Sevens, as the group is together pretty early on. First off is Roman Kirishima. She's not too fond of duels, but as the series progresses, this is something that she comes to terms with and improves on. Next up is Gakuto Sogetsu, the student body president who, let's face it, he's Kiyotaka from Danganronpa, and that is more than fine by me. He's a fan of bad puns, and I have to make mention of this. One of his monsters' names is translated to Hero is the Yeet. This is most likely not going to be the English name of the card, but man, I do not even care. This is that card's name now. And with that, we've come to the end of the road on our Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime retrospective. It's been a long time coming for me, and this script is nearing 15,000 words, but I am more than ecstatic to be able to spread the good word about how good and even insane this series gets. I'm going to take a little break now that this video is out, since I was working on this one and my Metroid chronology at the same time, but next time we'll be tackling the trading card game, how to play it, deck building tips, and examples of decks I like to run so you can see the logic behind them. Thank you all for watching this long video, and I hope to see you next time. Hello everybody, and welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Explained! Last time we covered the anime and the various series that have released over the years. I do need to make a quick addendum, as ever since that episode released, we actually have gotten the announcement that the next Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, tentatively titled Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush, has been announced, and seems to be a sequel set in the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's world. I just wanted to make a note of this because I wasn't able to in the last episode, But now we'll be moving into the topic of today's video, and that is the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. Yeah, a full video in and we haven't even discussed how the game itself is played, but I promise it's for a reason. This game is complicated, and there is a way to learn it, but there are infinitely more ways to be confused and overwhelmed by it. So this is my attempt to be comprehensive while also being easy to understand. So I'll be breaking this video into a few different videos. Types of cards, types of games, rules of those games, and then deck building tips. And this is run from the future because the types of cards portion of this video can be crazily larger than I initially imagined it. It's going to be in its own video with the tutorial on the types of games, rules, and deck building tips will be the next video. I think it's kind of hard to understand the rules of the game if you don't understand what the cards are, or even the first thing about what they do. So here lies the logic of how this video will flow. In the description will be timestamps to the category and subcategory of the topic you want to learn more about. But please understand this is a very introductory lesson, and not absolutely 100% everything you need to be a master about any of these topics. I'll post some of the links in the description and call out some specific other creators who focus on certain parts of the card and video game aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! That I highly recommend checking out if one or more parts of these interest you. With that out of the way, let's get ready to duel! Alright, so Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are kind of like an optical illusion. Just plastering these all over the screen and they look like a mess of jumbled information and numbers and images. Nah, Mom, please, it's too much. But there is a logic to these, and I'll help break these cards down bit by bit. First and foremost, we have three different types of cards: monster cards, spell cards, and trap cards. These designations go deeper and have a bunch of different subsections that we'll cover, but looking from a bird's eye view up, this is what we have. Monster cards are the bread and butter of your deck. They house the creatures that in most cases you'll be using to claim victory. Here at the top we have the name of this monster here, the Dark Magician. Pretty iconic monster for fans of the anime, as this was primarily used by Yugioh. Right to the right of the monster's name is the monster's attribute. This is an elemental value that can be one of 6 elements: wind, water, fire, earth, dark, and light. In most cases, this is obvious to the monster it's attributed to, like our Dark Magician here is Dark Attribute. This doesn't have any immediate effect on our monster, but it can determine what spell or other effects can affect our monster here. I'll bring this up later. Next, these orange dots with the stars in them are what's known as a monster's level. We'll get into more about this in the game rules, but generally, a higher level monster usually denotes or implies its strength. Higher level monsters will often require the sacrifice of lower level monsters to summon them out. Dark Magician here is a level 7 monster. Again, we'll go over more of this later, but if we were hypothetically wanting to summon this monster out, typically we would need to sacrifice or tribute 2 monsters in order to bring it out. Here, of course, is the art of the monster. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to point it out. Moving down, we have the effect or the description box. Depending on the type of monster, this box here will list the details of the special abilities that each monster has. Dark Magician, however, is what is known as a normal monster, noted by the hue of the card. Normal monsters have no special abilities, so the text down here tends to be flavor text. However, the text right above it in the brackets here denotes the type of the monster. Dark Magician here is a spellcaster, which, like the attributes, can help it be affected by different effects throughout the game. Now, I promise this will make more sense as we see duels in action. Monster cards are denoted by the color of the card, as here is what is known as an effect monster. Note the similarities in how the cards are lined up. The giant rat here is an earth attribute monster and is level 4. This monster requires no sacrifice in order to summon it. And if we see here, the text denotes that the giant rat is a beast and also an effect monster, and its effect reads as follows. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 earth monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck in attack position. Now, I know that this has some terms we haven't gone over, but we do recognize that it's an earth monster it calls for. So when this monster is defeated in battle, you get to automatically look for your deck for another monster that is earth attribute and summon it to the field in its place, even on your opponent's turn. So long as it follows the other rules of the effect, which brings us back to the attack and the defense values. Down here at the bottom of the card we have 2 values, attack and defense. Going back to Dark Magician, we see here that he's boasting 2,500 attack points and 2,100 defense points. Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster values are handled in multiples of 100, but there are a few stray examples where a monster will have a value that goes into the 50 intervals, 1050, 1450, etc. These values will be important because your attack value is the number you want attacking your opponents, so the higher the value, the better your odds at winning. Usually. So that's all the parts of a normal and an effect monster. Not too bad. As a quick review, normal monsters have no special effects, and the attributes and types of the monsters they are determine what effects they're affected by, like how the Giant's Rat ability here affects earth monsters in your deck. The level here denotes the number of tributes you'll need to summon that monster. Higher level monsters will need more tributes to summon. I glossed over it before, but here's the scale to level to tribute ratio. Monsters level 1 to 4 can be summoned freely without any tributes. Monsters level 5 to 6 require 1 tribute. Monsters from level 7 to 9 require 2 tributes, and the rare level 10 monsters and above, unless otherwise stated, will require 3 tributes. Make sense? Okay, next we're going to move on to fusion monsters. These cards are purple in color, and as their name implies, are a fusion of multiple monsters. Typically, these monsters require the use of a spell card to be summoned out. They aren't just something you can throw down by themselves. I say usually, but newer cards have newer ways to get these out, and I'll go over some specific examples in a little bit. However, in most cases, you'll be using a card called Polymerization. We've still yet to go over spell cards, so I won't go too deep into detail here yet, but this here card is basically a catalyst for turning your smaller monsters into larger fusions. The monster we have here, Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, is a level 12, light attribute, dragon type, fusion monster. Level in this case doesn't matter too much because you're not tribute summoning it, so that's one bit of information we can discard of relevant information on our table. Here, fusion monsters have a lot of similarities to the monsters we've had before. Blue Eyes Ultimate here, in its card text box, says it needs 3 Blue Eyes White Dragon monsters in order to fusion summon it, which looks like this. Another familiar monster to fans of the anime. Now, Blue Eyes itself is a level 8 light attribute dragon monster, meaning it requires 2 tribute summons to get out. By and large, fusions are usually large sources of power in the deck, and we can see here that Blue Eyes Ultimate is boasting some very large attack prowess at 4,500 attack. However, the fact that it does not have any special abilities does hinder its usefulness by a lot. It's a beat stick that does high damage, but is quite hard to get it out, so its usefulness leaves a lot to be desired. Let's take a look at another familiar example of a card from the anime, the Red Eyes Black Dragon. This is another normal monster who's level 7 dark attribute dragon type monster. It's a normal monster, so it has no special effects. With 2,400 attack, this is honestly pretty low for a monster that requires 2 tributes. Typically you'd want something that has Blue Eyes level of strength at 3,000 attack or more. However, Red Eyes does have something over the Blue Eyes White Dragon in a related fusion monster, the Red Eyes Slash Dragon. Now, just looking at this, we can see that there's a lot more going on down here, and we'll get there in a minute, but I want to continue to re-establish the fundamentals we've seen in other cards. Red Eyes Slash Dragon is a dark attribute, level 7 dragon type monster that is also a fusion monster and has a special effect. Its attack is 2,800 and its defense is 2,400. In order to summon this monster, you will need 1 Red Eyes Black Dragon and any other monster that's a warrior. Now, let me tell you, warriors are plenty in this card game, so you can choose literally any monster that fits that designation. The good thing about the fusion monster being good is how easy it is to bring it out. So with this, it can be really easy to bring out this dragon. Now for its special effect. When this card declares an attack, you can target 1 warrior monster in your GY, which in this case GY is shorthand for graveyard. You can target 1 warrior monster in your graveyard and equip it to this monster as an equipped spell card that gives this card 200 attack. Okay, so we're still seeing some more stuff about spell cards, and we'll still go over this in more detail after. But for the purpose of this explanation, as in the name, an equipped spell card is a spell card that equips to a selected monster. Usually it'd give it some sort of positive effect. So, now parsing this, you can take any 1 warrior monster in your graveyard and bring it back to the field and equip it to the Red Eyes Slash Dragon and give it a 200 attack power boost, making it now have 3,000 attack. And You're guaranteed to have a warrior type monster in the graveyard if you have this card out on the field, as it requires one warrior type monster to fusion summon. However, this effect isn't done yet. When a card or effect is activated that targets a card you control, you can send one equipped card you control to the graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. So, say you have this card out and it's equipped with a warrior monster. I'm going to use the example of Elemental Hero Neo's Alias here. It's a warrior type monster that we can see. Now, say your opponent wants to play a card or an effect of their own that would destroy our Red Eyes Slash Dragon. Your dragon has the ability to ditch that equipped warrior monster back to the graveyard to completely shield itself from that effect. Now, your dragon would lose that 200 attack buff it got, but if we remember that first ability, when a Red Eyes monster declares an attack, you can easily on your next turn declare an attack, get that same warrior monster back equipped to your dragon, get those attack points back, and get that shield back. So you see how much more utility this monster has than the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon's "Hi, I have a big number, please die." And that's not even the last of its effects. Red Eyes Slash Dragon has one final ability. If this card is destroyed by battle or by card effect, so, say hypothetically your opponent had two cards ready to destroy your dragon, one to get rid of the shield and one to get rid of the dragon all in the same turn, you can special summon as many monsters from your graveyard as possible that were equipped to this card. So if your dragon somehow gets taken down, it doesn't leave you fully defenseless on its destruction. This here is the utility that some cards can have. Now, that's fusion in a very close-knit box. There's way more out there to learn, and in general, these are combinations of monsters that are summoned by usually using a spell card like Polymerization. Although some monsters, like the Red Eyes Slash Dragon here, may use more specialized fusion cards called Red Eyes Fusion. And one final thing about fusion cards, they aren't placed in your normal deck. We'll go over more of this in the game rules section, but with all the other monsters we've talked about thus far, they're part of your main deck, the deck that you draw from every turn. Fusion monsters, however, go into what is called the extra deck. This is where almost all of the other extra type of monsters will be held in, but the exceptions we'll go over as we continue. Starting off next, we have Ritual Monsters. These cards are one of two to be denoted with this distinctive blue coloring, but as we'll come to see soon later on, there's a bit more obvious visual differences between them. Ritual monsters are similar to fusion monsters in the fact that they require a spell card in order to summon their monsters out. Now, ritual cards were a lot more different to fusion cards back in the day, as they didn't have a uniform card to ritual summon every single monster like fusions had with Polymerization. But now that fusions have branched out with more and more specified fusion cards, rituals don't really have that distinction anymore. Overall, ritual monsters are probably the hardest form of monster card to work with, as they don't reside in the extra deck. So the risk with running these guys in your deck is you run a very real chance of drawing into them without any of the materials in your hand. Or you draw the material without ever drawing into them. Meaning you have a dud in your hand until you're able to draw what you need. Now this monster here is a hand-picked example I chose of a really good ritual monster. This is the Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, and yes, these names can get real long. People tend to shorten it to Chaos Max Dragon. This monster requires the spell card Chaos Form, which effect reads, this card can be used to ritual summon any Chaos or Blackluster Soldier ritual monster. You must also tribute monsters from your hand or field, and or banish Blue Eyes White Dragon or Dark Magician from your graveyard, whose total levels exactly equal the level of the Chaos or Blackluster Soldier ritual monster you ritual summon. So this card here works for more than just the Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we'll only concern ourselves with the effects of summoning our dragon out. So here it specifies two things, a Blue Eyes White Dragon, and or a monster that has a level count that is the same as the monster we're trying to summon. So moving back to Chaos Max, we can see here that its level is 8. So you can either use a level 8 monster on your hand or field, or a Blue Eyes White Dragon in your graveyard. This is a really good amount of variety here, as it gives you a lot of options to get it out onto the field. Now, Blue Eyes can be a pretty worthy resource, as well as any other level 8 monster. What kind of boon are you getting for that high cost? First and foremost, Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon has a beefy 4000 attack stat. This is enough to run over almost any kind of monster you see in battle, which you might notice is a little bit less than the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. But we also noticed that it has 0 defense points. Now that's not great, but we'll see in a second there are protections against this weakness and its effect, which is what makes it better than Blue Eyes Ultimate because it does have a special ability. So here we have a very specific line of text here in the effect saying that this card must be ritual summoned, which means it cannot be special summoned to the field by other ways other than the Chaos Form spell card. This is a part of why rituals are harder to justify a slot in the deck, as their means of summoning are limited to their ritual spell card, whereas other monster types typically have multiple ways to get their cards out. But not all is bad, as the next section here is saying that your opponent cannot target this card with effects, and it cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. Notice how this says card effects and not monster effects or spell effects or trap effects. This is protected from being targeted and destroyed, implying that with the exception of very few cards or effects, the only way you're getting over this behemoth is by battling it, in which we see here, 4,000 is a very high attack value. Next, and the cherry on top of when it attacks an opponent's monster in defense position, it inflicts double piercing battle damage. Now that's pretty nasty. Say you have an opposing man-eater bug on your opponent's field. I bring this example up, not because you'll reasonably see it in play today, but because it's a pretty recognizable monster from the olden days of Yugioh. Man-eater bug is an effect monster whose main gimmick is being set down to act as a trap for opponents to attack into, as its effect here states that when it's flipped up, you get to destroy one monster on the field. Now, someone might want to be cheeky by sending this little critter out to eke out a victory over the mighty dragon, but instead, you'll be guaranteeing your opponent's victory. So let's play it out. Chaos Max attacks Man-eater bug, revealing it and activating its effect. But, oh no, Chaos Max cannot be targeted or destroyed by its effects, so Chaos Max's attack will continue through. We see Man-eater bug has 600 defense points, and going to Chaos Max's attack of 4,000, that means it's a clear victory. But wait, one might ask, Man-eater bug is in defense position, so it does not take any damage from your opponent's attack, you say. And right you are, even though we're getting a little bit ahead of our tutorial here. In normal circumstances, yes, Man-eater bug would be destroyed, and you would take 0 damage to your life points from this battle. However, we remember Chaos Max's last ability, the one to inflict double piercing battle damage. Piercing here is a standardized word in Yugioh, which means you will take any battle damage between the difference of the attacking monster's attack points and the defending monster's defense points. And Blue Eyes does double. That's 6,800 life points of damage from a single battle. And now you're back into a corner. In a normal 8,000 life point game, you're left with 1,200 life points, assuming this interaction happened when you had the maximum amount of life points remaining. And your next move is likely one of 2 steps. You're either going to summon a monster in attack position, or in defense position. And either way, you'll be facing an onslaught the next turn that will most likely eliminate the rest of your life points. Now, there are counters to this card, and ways to get over it. For example, an effect monster named Ultimate Conductor Tyranno has an effect that can be helpful in taking down the dreaded dragon. Well, it has a lot of effects, honestly. We'll just focus on this one here that lets you destroy one monster in your hand or on your field, and you get to flip all the monsters on your opponent's side of the field face down in defense. And now that big scary dragon has a very large goose egg to defend itself. There are more examples, but this is just one in how ritual cards can be utilized. Overall, these are my least favorite types of monsters. Next up, we have the beginning, where people started to drop off on Yugioh. Synchro monsters. They are denoted by their white backgrounds, and like fusion monsters, reside in the extra deck, meaning you don't draw into them. They also, like fusion monsters, typically take more than one monster in order to fusion summon them. However, unlike fusion monsters, their summoning materials are a bit more open and less limited. The example card I'm going to use now is the Stardust Dragon, the ace of the character from the anime that introduced synchro summoning, Yusei Fudo. Stardust Dragon here is a wind attribute monster that's level 8, and down here we see it as a dragon synchro effect monster, with an attack of 2,500 and a defense of 2,000. This stat spread is common for the ace monsters of the protagonists of the shows. The synchro aspect here is a big factor of these cards, for in order to synchro summon a monster, you need one tuner and one non-tuner monster. What is a non-tuner monster? So far, everything we've covered. Tuner monsters are monsters that have specific designations as being tuner monsters. They are typically levels 1 to 3, with a few level 4 tuner monsters here and there, and way fewer level 5 and above tuners. For tuners, levels are everything. They are such low levels often because they tend to tune up monsters of also low levels in order to sync or summon monsters that have a level total, the sum of the two monsters. Now, tuners can be anything. They can be normal monsters, effect monsters, ritual monsters, fusion monsters, literally anything. Heck, even synchro monsters can be tuner monsters. We'll go over that specific situation in a moment. If we wanted to synchro summon, we can take this junk synchron here, which is a level 3 effect tuner monster. And if we look back to the Stardust Dragon we were looking at earlier, it's a level 8 synchro monster, which means we're missing a level 5 monster from this equation. We can take any level 5 monster here in this situation, because we've already fulfilled the condition of having the tuner monster in junk synchron. So we have our two monsters, we just summon our dragon and we draw these two, right? It's that easy? Unfortunately, no. This is the first extra monster type where the materials you use need to be both summoned to the field in order to initiate a synchro summon. Typically, tuners have abilities which allow them to come to the field easier, so it's not as bad a drawback, but it is noticeably more strict than, say, something like fusions, where you can bring them out using materials in your hand or field. However, since synchro monsters are in your extra deck, in most cases you can special summon these monsters to the field by other ways using specific cards. It doesn't exactly have the restriction of ritual cards by only being able to come out with their one summon method. Next for synchros are monsters that aren't really delineated in the card game, but are made a special example of in the anime. Excel synchros. This is a synchro monster that is comprised of 2 or more synchro monsters. One that is not a tuner and one that is. Meaning you have to synchro summon the first monster. In this case we'll use Stardust Dragon like we did before, and we'll use that junk synchron and whatever level 5 monster we decided to use here. Then we'll need to synchro summon Formula Synchron. This is a light machine synchro tuner effect monster that requires 1 tuner and 1 non-tuner monster. So basically, you'll need a level 1 monster that's a tuner and a level 1 monster that's not, such as Formula Synchron here is level 2. Next, that we have those 2 synchro monsters on the field, you can synchro summon an Excel synchro monster, Shooting Star Dragon. This is a level 10 synchro monster whose card effect text is that of a Herman Melville short story and with stats higher than the Stardust Dragon and Formula Synchron combined. I'm not going to analyze its effects here, but it basically does a lot of things and does it better than Stardust Dragon would. Of course, going to the Excel Synchro tier is completely optional and is not required in order to play synchro monsters. You can run decks that just go to Stardust Dragon and do just fine. I just wanted to show you how the depths at which you can go. Synchro monsters as a whole are really powerful, and there are plenty of decks out there that utilize a vast array of synchro monsters, considering their generally more lax summoning conditions. Moving forward, we go into the main summoning mechanic introduced in Yu-Gi-Oh's Exile, Exceeds monsters. Now, I know the community has historically had trouble pronouncing this one. Some saying XYZ, or some saying Exceed, but the proper pronunciation is Exceeds. These monsters have a black background and on the surface have some differences to the other cards. The card I'm going to be using for an example here is the Ace monster of Zexal's protagonist, number 39 Utopia. We see here it's a light attribute. What is this here? Well, my fine friends, this is Utopia's Rain. They are black circles with gold stars on them, very similar to a monster's level, but it's on the opposite side of the card here. So Exceeds monsters don't have levels, which means that effects that affect a monster's level don't affect Exceeds monsters. Similarly, it means they can't be used for a ritual or a synchro summon, as those methods rely on the monster's levels in order to resolve. Other than that, another difference with Exceeds monsters comes from how they're summoned. Right here, we see their summoning mechanics right above the card text, 2 level 4 monsters. So similar to synchro summoning, you'll need monsters with certain levels to be on the field in order to initiate an Exceeds summon. In this case, and is the case with other Exceeds monsters, the requirements will be monsters of the same level. So here we have 2 level 4 monsters needing to be on the field in order to summon out Utopia. However, there is another explicit difference in what happens to the monsters that you sacrifice in order to make the summon. With fusions, rituals, and synchro summons thus far, the monsters you use go to the graveyard as the new monster is summoned out. However, with Exceeds monsters, you keep them on the field and place them underneath the Xyz monster, overlaying them. The monsters underneath are not counted as active monsters on the field, but instead as overlay units. These are basically used as ammunition for the effects of the Xyz monster. For example, when any player's monster declares an attack, you can detach one Xyz material from this card and negate the attack. When this card is targeted for an attack while it has no Xyz materials, destroy this card. So here we have a pretty good effect and also a system of checks and balances. A method to defeat this card if you brought your back against the wall. Like the previous monsters, Xyz monsters are kept in the extra deck. One final note about Xyz monsters is a topic known as Xyz evolution. This is similar to how Synchro monsters could combine to create Excel Synchro monsters, higher tiered monsters that have better stats and abilities. Here, Xyz evolutions will use other Xyz monsters as their material for summoning, and will also keep any overlay units that the original Xyz monster had. One example of this is Cyber Dragon Nova. This one's a personal favorite of mine. It requires 2 level 5 machine monsters to be summoned out. In this case, you can use the normal Cyber Dragon cards to overlay into Nova. Then when you get Nova out, you can further summon out Cyber Dragon Infinity. As while normally Infinity requires 3 level 6 machine type monsters, its effect here denotes that Cyber Dragon Nova itself is usable for material. Moving forward now, you go to Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5's introduction of Pendulum monsters. Pendulums are the hardest monsters to talk about, and are where most people in the community denote as their least favorite monster type, if not rituals. These are monsters that are in part half monster and half spell. And as we see here, they are half the color that they normally are, like an effect monster here, and half green on the bottom to denote they're half spell. I know we haven't fully gone over spells yet, but basically they have 2 sets of effects, like effect monsters where you follow depending on where you face on field. Also, important note, Pendulum monsters primarily exist within the main deck, similar to ritual monsters, so you will draw into these. You can normal summon it in the monster zone, like a monster that has attack and defense points, and then you'd use the effect down here like an effect monster. Or you can place it down in the spell and trap card zone as a spell card that remains on the field, and use this effect up here, ignoring the stats and the other effects. However, when you play a Pendulum monster in the spell and trap card zone for one, you can place 2 down and perform an action called Setting the Pendulum Scale. You notice these 2 honkers, right? These are scale values, and each Pendulum card has an associated number with them. And in all cases, the number here on the left and the right are the same. So, Odd Eye's Pendulum Dragon scale value is 4 here. Another example here is of the card Time Gazer Magician, who has a scale value of 8. What do these numbers mean, you might ask? Well, when you have 2 Pendulum cards summoned as spells in what's known as the Pendulum Zone, or otherwise known as their spaces in the spell and trap card zones that you can keep things organized, you can successfully set the Pendulum scale with the values of 4 and 8. This will now allow you to Pendulum summon, a unique way to special summon monsters out from your hand. You see, you can set the scale with any sort of value, and if you have the scale set in what we have here, you can freely summon out to the field any monster that has a level in between the scale values we've set. So in this example, if we have any level 5, 6, or 7 monsters in our hand, we'll be able to dump them all on the field for free. The best case example is to get a monster with a low value scale, such as the Stargazer Magician, whose scale is 1, alongside the Time Gazer Magician, which we brought out as an example earlier. Meaning, you can Pendulum summon any monster in your hand for free that is levels 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. This can allow you to freely continue to summon further by Synchro and Xyz summoning. Pendulum monsters are sort of like tuner monsters, in the sense that other types of monsters can also be Pendulum monsters, like fusions, Xyz, rituals. The only difference is that they mostly exist in the extra deck, except by drawing them in your hand. So setting the Pendulum scale with them is a bit more involved, with the exception of the rituals, of course, because they're going to be into your main deck. And the final thing with Pendulums is that when they leave the field, they do not go to the graveyard like any other monster card. They instead make their own sort of graveyard face up in the extra deck. This means that the effects that special summon monsters or affect monsters in the graveyard cannot affect them. However, other Pendulum monsters' effects tend to help bring them back to the field with their own effects. Next up, we're going to be moving on to the card type introduced in Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains, Link Monsters. In normal Yu-Gi-Oh! Duels, this is the most recent card type added. They feature these cards with blue backgrounds similar to ritual monsters, but there's plenty different here on the face from a ritual monster. There's a distinctive honeycomb pattern running across the background, and just on the border of the card art is what we call link markers. Different link monsters will have different arrows lit up in red on the link markers, and these denote which zones on the field are affected by the card's passive buffs or nerfs. For example, Decode Talker has 3 link markers on it, one pointing directly above it, and another 2 pointing to the lower left and lower right. We'll get more to the specifics of this more in duels, but basically, any cards that this card points to are what are affected by and to. In Decode Talker's case, it actually gains 500 attack points for every card it points to. Now, there are some other large differences with link monsters here we need to talk about. First and foremost is the lack of a level and a rank. Yep, up here it's completely blank. So these monsters cannot be used as a material for synchro summons or XE summons, and like the other monsters we've seen thus far, they exist within the extra deck. So they're not going to be able to be Penjas summoned out from the hand. Next comes their lack of defense points. So this here means that link monsters can only be summoned and remain in attack mode, and effects that would flip them face down or into defense mode do not affect link monsters. Similarly to how effects that target monsters with levels or have anything to do with levels do not affect them. In order to summon a link monster, you're effectively performing a synchro or XE summon without the benefits or drawbacks of those summoning methods. Here, Decode Talker requires 2 or more effect monsters in order to summon it out. Like synchro and XYZ monsters, these need to be summoned onto the field. And the final monster type we'll talk about here is a maximum monster. This type of card is exclusive to the Rush Duel format. This type of dueling used within Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s. This is a large boss monster that's made up of multiple pieces. Each piece has its own separate attack and defense values alongside a maximum attack value for when they're all on the field together. One example of a maximum monster is Yugioh, the Heavenly Emperor Dragon Tree, who normally has an attack value of 2,000, but a maximum potential of 4,000 when combined with its 2 other pieces. Now, listen, I know this card looks a lot different to everything we've seen this far format-wise, and that's because Rush Duels use a different kind of Yu-Gi-Oh card, which lends itself better to those formats. I'll be going more over about this in the How to Play Rush Duel section in the next video. I've just been brought to attention 3 types of effect monsters I forgot to add into this script, because it's solely I don't use them or care about them. But here we go! Speed round! 1. Spirit monsters. They go back in your hand at the end of the turn. 2. Gemini monsters. They are normal monsters that get an effect if you waste your normal summon on an already summoned monster. 3. Union monsters. You attach them to other monsters to give them stats for effects. Okay, so monsters are finally, thankfully, done. And double thankfully, the next section's a lot simpler. Spell cards. So these cards are green cards that used to be called magic cards until Magic the Gathering didn't like that anymore. So shortly into Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, they had to change it to spell cards. If you have some older Yu-Gi-Oh cards in your collection, you may notice some cards are either magic cards or talk about magic cards. This is why that is. They mean the same thing now. They often have a single use you can play from your hand at any point as long as you have it in your hand. And they have that advantage over trap cards, which we'll go over in a moment. We've seen a few examples of spell cards in the previous sections, but for shits and giggles, let's bring back Raigeki into the mix. This here is a normal spell card that allows us to wipe the opponent's board clean of monsters. There are currently 6 types of spell cards out there, and I promise this won't take as long as the monsters. Normal spells. Cards like Raigeki. You use it, its effect goes off, it goes to the graveyard afterward. Continuous spells. These are denoted by the infinity symbol on the card face up here, and remain on the field, meaning the effect of the spell continues for as long as it remains on the field. A good example of this is Messenger of Peace, which states that monsters with more than 1500 attack points cannot attack. Although it comes with the drawback that every turn you must lose 100 life points in order to keep this card active every turn. Field Spell. This is a card you place outside of the normal spell and trap card zone right up here as a general field-wide buff to your cards or nerf to your opponent's cards. These, like continuous spell cards, will remain on the field unless destroyed or replaced. One simple example of a field spell is Umi, which grants a 200 attack and defense buff to all fish, sea serpent, thunder, and aqua monsters, and a 200 attack and defense nerf to all machine and pyro monsters. Quick play spells are spells that have higher priority than other spells, and if they're placed face down on the field, they can be activated on your opponent's turn. A good example of this is Twin Twisters. This lets you discard one card from your hand in order to target 2 spell and trap cards on the field and get rid of them. Equip spell cards are cards that attach and equip to one specific monster to give them a unique ability or buff to its stats. United We Stand is a solid one that gives any selected monster 800 extra attack and defense points for every monster you've summoned on the field. And finally, we have Ritual spell cards, which, as we discussed previously in the Ritual Monster section, are the only way you can summon out Ritual cards. The Chaos Form card we discussed back then is a perfect example of this. Next, we're going to move on to Trap cards. Trap cards are typically cards that focus more on harming your opponent, but can offer methods of protection. They differ, however, from spell cards, as in order to benefit from their effects, you must set them for one turn before they become active. What this means is if you place a trap card face down on the field, you must wait until your opponent's turn before you can activate it. And typically, although not always, they are activated in response to an opponent's action. Hence the ever-popular phrase,
"You triggered my trap card!"
These cards have a purplish red border, which are lighter than fusion cards, and they have the same priority as quick play spells, and higher priority than every other non-play quick. There are 3 types of trap cards, but I'll feel remiss if I don't mention the fact that the manga has 2 exclusive trap card types, being equip traps and field traps, which act identically to the equip and spell cards that we previously discussed. But for the first kind, we have normal traps. These are your everyday trap cards, and we'll use Trap Hole as an example. It's classic. Set it face down on your turn, and then on your opponent's turn, when they summon a monster over 1,000 attack points, boom, they fall into the hole and get destroyed. Continuous traps have the ability to remain on the field, and one example here is the trap card Gravity Bind. This card makes it so monsters over level 4 cannot attack. Which, as a side note, monsters that do not have a level like ACs or Link monsters get to ignore this card entirely. And finally, counter traps. These are denoted by the small arrow next to the trap card designation and are the highest priority card in the game. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, traps, spells, and monster effects have the honor of going back and forth in high level play with no you, no you, no you arguments back and forth. And counter traps are here to help break those situations up, as the only thing that can respond to a counter trap is another counter trap. Solemn Judgment here is a good example of one, as its effect is to pay half of your life points to say no to any one card effect, whether it be a spell, trap, or a monster's effect. You just say no. And with that, we have finally covered every single card type in Yu-Gi-Oh! And every deck has a selection of most of these cards. This video has grown way bigger than I initially expected it to be. But there you have it. You have the definitive answer to whenever someone tells you, "Oh man, I just can't understand Yu-Gi-Oh! They have too many things to know and I don't know what any of these new cards do." Now you know. How this is used in practice and in building a deck and how the actual game is played, that's all going to be saved for next time. I'm plenty tired of talking about monsters myself. But until then, I want to thank you all for checking this video out, and I recommend you subscribe if you want to check out more like it. Check you guys next time.
Schoolyard, finding trouble, never looking too hard. We're back at class, they never taught us this. Some things you gotta learn, hit or miss. Tough times, we'll take them on together. Right now, let's go. Yugioh GX, Generation X. Game on, get your game on. Come on, you better play your cards right. Game on, get your game on. We'll make the grade and win this fight. We'll make the grade somehow. Yeah, Yugioh GX. Game on, get your game on. Come on, you better play your cards right. Come on, get your game on.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Explained. Last time we talked about the various different types of cards you'll expect to see when you're playing the trading card game. I think it was very important to talk to you about those separately because it is instrumental to know what the cards do in order to play the game. If it's been a while since you've seen it, I recommend rewatching it. Now, first and foremost, we'll be talking about the most popular format of dueling and the type that you'll most are watching this video for. Master Duels. Master Duels are primarily what take place within the Yu-Gi-Oh anime. Of course, not every duel is classified as such, but with Yu-Gi-Oh 5Ds, Yu-Gi-Oh Vrains, and Yu-Gi-Oh 7s introducing their own gimmicks on the formula. But for the most part, if you think of a Yu-Gi-Oh duel, this is going to be that category. Two players will face each other in a duel, and each will be given a value of life points. This counts as your health in the duel. If your life points hit 0, you lose the duel. Now, as time has progressed, the default value of life points has grown over the years. With back in the old days, duelists in the first season of the anime dueled with 2,000 life points each, which then grew to 4,000, which finally settled on where we're at now with 8,000. The shows tend to revolve around the 4,000 point mark to keep duels fast-paced for the animation's sake, but if you're looking to play in the real world, 8,000 life points is the most commonly default value you find. Of course, nothing is stopping you and a friend from deciding to start with 3,000 life points, or 1,000, or hell, even 50,000. It's totally modifiable, but the closer you get to competitive, the less lax people are going to be on strength from the determined standard of 8,000. Now, how do you get your life points to 0, you ask? Well, let's begin. Both players will have a deck of cards that's between 40 and 60 cards, no less, no more. Now, you might not believe it, but this deck limit wasn't always a thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! There was one specific event that literally happened at the Yu-Gi-Oh! German Nationals in 2007, held in Hanover. Mike Schway and Tobias Einer here are seen carrying an absolute unit of a deck box, and yes, you are looking at that right, this is a container for a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck that they brought to a Nationals, because before this point, there was no hard limit on how large your deck could be. This thing contained 2,222 cards. The only rules at the time were that you had to bring a printed out version of your deck list to be verified by official judging staff. And the two of them certainly did. They have a monster of a PDF that they brought with them, which would have to be verified to enter the tournament. There's a video by Mega Capital G I'm going to link in the description. It talks about the prank in more detail. I highly suggest giving it a watch as it's extremely humorous, and it's the sole reason why we now, to this day, have an upper cap limit to 60 cards in one deck. Back to the game, your decks will contain 3 types of cards: monsters, spells, and traps. You can find more information about the card types in the previous video in the series that deep dives into all kinds of the cards. I'll go into detail about how to build a deck later, with an example of a few decks of my own that I like to run so you can see the underlying live logic of things to look for. But first, we're going to look and examine the field of play. Okay, so we saw this image a few times in the last video, but here's where we're going to go look at its depth. A full Yu-Gi-Oh! Field looks like this, with each player having their own half to work off of. In order to keep things simple, I'm only going to focus on this half here, because everything applies to this half applies to the other half. It just gives us less things to look at and makes it easier to see. Starting off here, we have the deck zone. This is where your full 40 to 60 card deck goes, and it'll remain here for the entirety of the duel. If you need to find a card in the deck because of an effect or when you draw a card, it'll be from this spot here. Then on the opposing side of the field, we have the extra deck zone. This is an entirely optional zone that you can work with depending if you have any cards in your extra deck. The extra deck is what holds your Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, and Link monsters if you recall from the previous episode. The only monsters that do not go in the extra deck are normal monsters, effect monsters, ritual monsters, and pendulum monsters. The extra deck can have anywhere between 0 to 15 cards in it, and its total count does not factor into the 40 to 60 limit in the main deck. You can have 60 cards in your main deck and 15 cards in your extra deck. That's totally fine, as is having 40 cards in your main deck and 0 cards in your extra deck. Each specific deck tends to work best at specific values, so as you grow to learn the deck that you choose, you'll be able to learn what those are. I will say though, generally, running the minimum amount of cards possible in your main deck is usually the recommended amount, as you'll be able to get to your really good cards more consistently than if you were to run the full 60. But again, there are outliers. Next up are the main monster zones. These take center stage on the field as they are arguably the most important. These zones are where your monsters are summoned to. Only one active monster can be in a zone at a time. I say active monster because, as we learned last time, Xyz monsters will have monsters underneath them used as materials for their effects. But only the monster on top counts then as a monster at that time. There are 5 zones here, meaning that there are 5 monsters you can have out here on the phones at one time. Which then leads me to the extra monster zones up here. There's 2 of these, one for you and one for your opponent. When you summon a monster from the extra deck, you can summon it to this zone here. So technically, you can have up to 6 monsters on the field at any one given time. Extra deck monsters can be placed in the main monster zone or in the extra monster zone. But normal and effect monsters can only be played in the main monster zone. And for one final limitation, Link monsters can be played in the extra monster zone, but they may only be played in the main monster zone if there is already a monster in your extra monster zone. Next up, we have the spell and trap zone. This is where you'll either set your spells and traps face down to use for later, or you'll play them face up to activate. Again, same deal, you have 5 spaces to hold 5 cards, so that you have that many opportunities to use spells and traps, so long as you have space for them on the field. On each of the spell and trap card zones also exists the pendulum zone. If you remember from the card explanation video, pendulum monsters are 1/2 spell and 1/2 monster. If you choose to play them as a spell card, you do what is called setting the pendulum scale. You will then put them into these 2 zones here. This is totally optional, and you're not required to use these as pendulum zones in case you are worried about losing out on 2 spell and trap card zones. But if you do play pendulum monsters this way, know that this is a sacrifice that you will have to make. Now, speaking of spell cards, up here in the top left is the field zone. Sounds kind of redundant, but it really means to say the field spell zone. If you remember from the previous video, field spells are the type of spell card that affects the entire battlefield and remains on the field unless it is specifically destroyed or replaced. Those will go up here. Finally, we have the graveyard. This is where cards go when they get used or are destroyed. Most spells and traps will go here after their use unless otherwise stated, and if monsters are destroyed by battle, tributed, or discarded from the hand, they'll similarly head to the graveyard. There's one final zone that isn't really showcased on the field here. It's called banished, or removed from play. Think of it as like being erased from the graveyard. Some cards have the effect to remove cards from play, as decks nowadays like to play off of cards that are in yours or your opponent's graveyard. It's typically just right above the graveyard here. Now that we have the field ready, we're going to go into specific rules of play. We know the cards, we know the field, now we'll get into the game proper. Both opponents will shuffle each other's deck, and typically you'll allow the opponent to cut your deck, just so the honor code can be upheld in case you suspect any foul shuffling may be afoot. You're going to need to then put your deck into the deck zone, then you'll determine who goes first. I'm sure you played enough card games before to be able to determine this, but just in case, typically a coin flip or the roll of a die is most helpful for determining. Who goes first or who goes second does have a pretty significant impact on the game itself, and each has some pros and some cons. There isn't a catch-all better one to be, although most people tend to prefer to play first, although I tend to prefer to go second myself. Next, both players are going to draw 5 cards from their deck. The first con of going first is that by going first, you're not going to draw a card at the start of your turn like normal. So, now that each player is started up, we're going to talk about the different phases that go into a player's turn. Each player goes through the same phases, and once you get used to seeing it and playing it, they'll feel second nature. First is the draw phase to begin each turn. You must draw 1 card if you begin your turn, unless of course you're going first, in which you skip your first draw phase. Next comes the standby phase. This is a bit of a hard one to explain, but it's like a transition between the draw phase and the next phase, called main phase 1. It sounds redundant to have a transition period in a phase itself, but effects from both you and your opponent can activate here during the standby phase. They happen specifically before the next phase happens, which is where the current player's turn can react, or use effects of their own. This will make sense as you play it, but for now, you can pretty much ignore it. as there's nothing specifically you need to do during the standby phase. It passes simply if no effects can be used. Next is main phase 1. This is the phase you'll typically spend the longest time in. Here you can summon monsters, play spells and traps, and even search the field as well as players' graveyards or your personal extra deck. Obviously you cannot search your own main deck unless you have a specific card that allows you to search, specifically for various other cards, but do remember at the end of those searches the deck must be reshuffled. Other important things to note: during your main phase 1, you can only normal summon one monster per turn. Normal summons are the most default summon in Yu-Gi-Oh!, although they aren't the most common nowadays. They are to be differentiated from special summons, which generally have no limit unless otherwise stated. Let's say we have a Dark Magician in our hand. This is a level 7 monster which would require 2 tributes of monsters you have on your side of the field in order to summon them out. If, let's say, it comes to our turn and we have 2 monsters on the field from previous turns, we can use our normal summon in order to send the other 2 monsters to the graveyard in order to summon the Dark Magician. Or you can special summon it. Let's rewind a little bit. Say we have those 2 monsters here on the field with the card face down in our spell and trap card zone. Let's say we set it down last turn. We could use our 2 monsters here to sacrifice to summon the Dark Magician, or we can flip over our face down Magician Navigation. This is a trap card that says special summon 1 Dark Magician from your hand, then special summon 1 level 7 or lower Dark Spellcaster monster from your deck. So we get to special summon the Dark Magician in our hand to our field, but we also get to special summon another level 7 Dark Spellcaster, which could be a second Dark Magician in our deck. But you could realistically use any monster that fits these conditions. And then it does have another effect, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of this explanation, so let's just say we now have 2 Dark Magicians out on the field for free, and you get to keep those 2 other monsters on your field. If your opponent's field was clear, instead of being able to attack with the single Dark Magician, you now have 4 monsters who are free to battle. It is very important to know that special summons are special, and require an effect in order to be able to do them. You don't decide between normal or special summoning a monster unless you have a specific designation on a card to do so, like the trap card we used. One quick note I'm going to make about this is to remember the spell cards can be activated on the same turn during the main phase. Any spell card in your hand is able to be activated as soon as you get it, but trap cards must be set face down and then wait a turn in order to activate. They can, however, activate on your opponent's turn right after you set it face down. It just needs to be past your end phase. Positions are important in Yu-Gi-Oh!, as it determines which value on the card is most important at the moment. Summon a monster in attack mode and it'll be able to attack when it comes to the battle phase, using its attack points. Or you'll set a monster face down in defense position. This shields it from your opponent's view, and in most cases, it's unable to attack unless flipped face up into attack position. It relies on its defense points to shield itself from enemy attacks on their battle phase. Another important thing is that when you summon a monster in its position, it is unable to change position until the next turn. So say we have our Dark Magician, which we summon to attack mode, it must stay in attack mode until our next main phase 1, where you are free to turn it face up, defense position. If a monster is in face down defense position, it must stay there or reveal itself and turn up into a face up attack. That was a lot, I know, but like everything, we'll put it into action in some test duels so we can see it all happen together. Next comes the battle phase. When you're sufficiently set with your main phase, you can choose to enter the battle phase. However, like the draw phase, if you go first, you're unable to conduct your first battle phase. That means, no, you can't stack the board and attack your opponent to get their life points down to 0 on your first turn without them having any chance to do anything. There are some toxic strategies that people have come up with in order to win on their first turn, though they typically are built on burning cards in your opponent's deck or utilizing effect damage, as if you run out of cards to draw, you will lose the game. You are fully able to damage the opponent on your first turn this way by using effect damage, but those decks need to be hyper-specifically built for this purpose and tend not to hold up playing games normally. When you are able to conduct your battle phase, you will take notice of the monsters that you are having in attack position. You will decide which monsters you want to attack, in which case you'll do a little bit of math, or if you're playing the video games, they'll do the math for you. To subtract the attack value between the monsters, say we have our Dark Magician battle again, we're attacking the opponent's Proto Cyber Dragon. Dark Magician has 2,500 attack points, and Proto Cyber Dragon has 1,100 attack points. If Dark Magician attacks Proto Cyber Dragon, then the other player will take 1,400 points of damage to their life points. If this happened at the start of the game, then they'd have 6,600 points of damage, assuming a full game of 8,000 points to start for the both of them. Proto Cyber Dragon would then be sent to the graveyard. If we had that second Dark Magician from before summoned to the field still, and those two other monsters, let's say Dark Magician Girl and the Magician of Black Chaos for theme's sake, these three monsters can still attack, and if our opponent still had a monster face down in defense position, we would need to attack that monster next. So let's use our Dark Magician Girl to attack this face down defense position monster. It flips up to reveal the Big Shield Gardener. This is a monster with a pretty hefty 2,600 defense points. Since Big Shield Gardener has 600 more defense points than we have attack points, we're going to take 600 points of damage to our life points. Again, assuming we started with 8,000, we'd be down to 7,400. Since the monster we were attacking it was defense position, our Dark Magician Girl remains on the field. It's not destroyed. It's important to note if we attacked an attack position monster that had a higher value, like the Cyber Dragon, a monster that has 2,100 attack points, we would take 100 points of damage, but Dark Magician Girl would also be destroyed from this battle and be sent to the graveyard. So it's important to keep the values of the monsters you're knowing when fighting Enable. Back to our example, our Dark Magician Girl was unable to destroy the Big Shield Gardener. But worry not, for now it's time for the Big Shield Gardener's effect to activate. If it's attacked, it must change to attack position at the end of damage calculation, so it now changes to attack mode, and it has a measly 100 attack points. We can now follow up and make the most of our mistake here. Our second Dark Magician here can follow the attack now and do a whopping 2,400 points of damage. If we're running with that same values as before, our opponent would now have 4,200 life points remaining. With that monster cleared, our opponent's field is now empty. Our Dark Magician of Chaos has 2,800 attack points and can use its full force to attack our opponent directly. Our opponent takes 2,800 points and is left with 1,400 life points remaining and 4 terrifying monsters on the field to face off with, and an empty field of their own. In this instance, we would end the battle phase and then move on to the second to last phase, the main phase 2. This is exactly what it sounds like on the tin. It's another main phase, or rather a second chance at a main phase. This does not give you an additional normal summon, but if you did not normal summon in main phase 1, then you can normal summon in main phase 2. You can, however, use spells and traps as well as special summon if you're able to do like normal in this phase. When you are satisfied, you will transition into the final phase of the turn, the end phase, and then it becomes the next player's draw phase, and the cycle begins again. The player going second has the benefit of allowing a draw phase and the ability to conduct the battle phase on their first turn. But a downside to going second is you don't have an opportunity to react to anything your opponent is doing on the first turn, since you have not yet had a chance to set any monsters, spells, or traps. They are basically allowed to be able to set any monsters, spells, and traps of their own without any response from you, with the exception of a very few amount of cards, but those specific cases I'll go over when we go over specific duels. The two players will continue to go back and forth in this cycle: draw phase, standby, main phase 1, battle phase, main phase 2, and repeat, until one player loses all of their life points or they're unable to draw any cards. Now that you have the basic rules, you have the cards, you have the field, and you've probably seen the anime once or twice in order to get the general flow of things, what else is there to know? Well, that of course is deck building. The deck is the most important tool of a duelist as it controls how you play the game. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not the best at building decks, but I'm going to show you some deck of my own in a short bit. But for the specific how-tos, I'm going to list a video in the description for you to follow up on that is from a creator in the scene who knows a lot more than I do. Simo is a really talented creator who is deeply knowledgeable about the competitive scene, and I highly recommend subscribing to him, as he frequently makes videos on the competitive scene, ban list analysis, etc. The specific video I'm listing here is Yugioh, How to Choose a Deck, which talks about some of the mindsets behind choosing a deck to play. In this video, he talks about the 4 general playstyles of deck: aggro, combo, control, and stun. Finding out which playstyle best suits your own taste will help make the choice of what kind of deck play that much clearer and easier to make. I don't want to steal his info, so I'm going to double down on recommending you check out the video. It's only 10 minutes, learn yourself some knowledge. Of course, Yu-Gi-Oh! Tends to run with a meta that picks a certain amount of very strong decks and elevates them to the top. But there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of different archetypes with cards that synergize with one another. Honestly, if you have absolutely zero clue about what deck you want to run and are looking to run something casual, I'm going to recommend the different anime series. Each character in the anime runs a different type of deck, and who knows, maybe you'll find one of them really interesting and want to know more about how it plays, or maybe just like the art, or how certain cards look. After all, outside of being a really good story with good characters, that is a function of the anime, to be able to showcase new cards and archetypes. Go try some and see if there's anything you like. Though if you want usable decks, I'd recommend watching anything after the first series, Duel Monsters, as especially with the first season, they tend to make up their own rules as they go along. With that, I want to bring up a deck of my own, and then I'll commentate a duel with it, so stopping to explain the action as it happens. So I'm running this duel on Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. This is a free-to-play duel simulator that is officially sanctioned by Konami, and is currently the best official way to play Master Duels online with other people. I'll talk more about this game specifically next time in a video game episode, but we will be using it to showcase the duels I demonstrate. If you're interested, this game is available on literally every platform under the sun. Now with that said, the deck I'm going to explain first here is one I've shown quite a few cards of already in the last episode, Cyber Dragons. For you anime enthusiasts, or folks with a good memory, this is the archetype that Zane Truesdale from Yu-Gi-Oh! GX runs, although it has some cards that were made after he used them, of course. As I bring up the deck list, I have to make another quick announcement to note. You are limited to running 3 copies of most cards. However, there is a banned, semi-limited, and limited list that will ban, semi-limit, and limit the number of cards that can be used in your deck. For translation, unlimited is 3 copies of a card can exist in your deck. Semi-limited means 2 copies of a card can exist in your deck. Limited means 1 copy of a card can exist in your deck. And then banned, or forbidden as it's sometimes called, is 0 copies of a card can exist in your deck. It's important to realize how many copies of each card you can and should put in your deck. If you're playing Master Duel or any other Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game, this will be made obviously apparent to you. If you're playing in real life, it'll be up to you to keep up with the ban list changes as they happen. Of course, if you're playing casually, play with whatever you feel like. You and whoever you play with can use or restrict whatever cards you want. In my deck here, I'm running no banned or limited cards, but I am running 1 semi-limited card, of which I'll point out when we get to explaining it. So, Cyber Dragons. This is a deck that revolves around the monster Cyber Dragon. This is a level 5 light machine monster who has 2100 attack points and 1600 defense points. It has the special ability of being able to be special summoned to the field if your opponent controls a monster on their field and you have none on yours. This is a ridiculously good ability that can allow you to get this monster out earlier than normal, which helps its combo potential. Before we discuss said potential, let's go into the other cards. I'm going to briefly explain them here because we'll get more into what they do during the duel. Monsters. 3 Cyber Dragon Hertz, 1 copy of Cyber Pharaohs, 3 copies of Cyber Dragon Natchester, 2 copies of Max C, 3 copies of Cyber Dragon Core, 2 copies of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, 1 copy of Cyber Dragon's Vi, 2 copies of Cyber Dragon Dry, 2 copies of Cyber Dragon Veer, 3 copies of Cyber Dragon, and 2 copies of Galaxy Soldier. Then we go into the spells, which include 1 copy of Dark Hole, 3 copies of Machine Duplication, 1 Power Bond, 2 copies of Overload Fusion, 3 copies of Cyber Emergency, 1 copy of Cyber Repair Plant, 1 copy of Cyber Rev System, 2 copies of Lightning Storm, and 1 copy of Called by the Grave. Called by the Grave here is the card on my list that's semi-limited. It's a fake mix, so you can target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it, and its effects are also negated as well as other monsters that shed the same name on the field until the end of the turn. With how graveyard focused a lot of decks are nowadays, this is an incredibly powerful card, so you can only have 2 of them in one deck. Then we have Traps, of which there's only 2 of this deck, and they are 2 copies of Infinite Impermanence, which brings us a total of 41 cards in the main deck. Then we shift over to the extra deck, 2 copies of Chimeratech Rampage Dragon, 2 copies of Cyber Twin Dragon, 1 copy of Chimeratech Fortress Dragon, 2 copies of Chimeratech Ober Dragon, 2 copies of Chimeratech Mega Fleet Dragon, 1 copy of Cyber Eternity Dragon, 2 copies of Cyber Dragon Nova, 2 copies of Cyber Dragon Infinity, and 1 copy of Cyber Dragon Seeger. Now, you'll remember the Cyber Dragon Nova and Cyber Dragon Infinity from the previous episode when we talked about Xyz monsters and Xyz Evolution, which said, example of this is Cyber Dragon Nova. This one's a personal favorite of mine. It requires 2 level 5 machine monsters to be summoned out. In this case, you can use the normal Cyber Dragon cards to overlay into Nova. Then when you get Nova out, you can further summon out Cyber Dragon Infinity. As while normally Infinity requires 3 level 6 machine type monsters, its effect here denotes that Cyber Dragon Nova itself is usable for material. So that's 15 cards filling up our extra deck in a near minimum main deck. With this, let's go over to a duel. Okay, so we're here with some Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, or begin a duel with a coin flip. I win here, so I'm free to choose whether we go first or second. My playstyle tends to like going second, so we're going to do this, and my opponent here is going to begin their draw phase. Since they're going first, they're going to skip this and go straight to the standby and then main phase 1. Onat plays the spell card Xian's Smoke Signal, which reads, add 1 level 3 or lower 6 samurai monster from your deck to your hand. This tells us a few things. Our opponent here is running a 6 samurai themed deck, which tends to focus on special summoning a lot of monsters, and using them to bring out their extra deck monsters. And with that, Onat is going to be able to search his deck and be able to add 1 level 3 or lower monster to their hand. Here, in response, I can activate the effect of Max C in my hand. This is an extremely powerful card, even if its numbers may not make it seem so. This card is in my hand, I can send it to the graveyard on my opponent's turn, and for every time my opponent special summons a monster for the rest of their turn, I get to draw a card. Now, this puts pressure on Onat here, because I know with a high chance of probability that they're running a deck that likes to special summon a lot of monsters. Will they continue with their plan to special summon to make an offensive presence on the board, or will they delay their plans to avoid letting me draw more cards? Let's see what Onat chooses. They add a 6 samurai monster to their hand, and then normal summons it to the field. Now, this is the important part, because its effect lets them special summon a level 4 or lower 6 samurai monster from their hand to the field. They do, and I get to draw a new card. Sweet! Then they play Scrolls of the Samurai, a card that lets Onat tribute both of their monsters to special summon Great Shogun Xian, a stronger monster from their deck, which means we get another card from the deck on our side. Onat sets a card face down and skips to the end phase. So this is the power of Max C. 1 card and we've got 2 extra cards to work with. I begin the draw phase and then I place the trapped card Infinite Impermanence face down. This card lets me shut down a single monster's effect for 1 turn. I don't need it right now, so I'm going to save it for later. Then I'm going to activate Cyber Dragon Natchester's effect, which lets me discard 1 other monster in my hand to special summon it to the field. The important thing here with Natchester, like many other Cyber Dragon monsters, is that while it's on the field or in the graveyard, its name becomes Cyber Dragon. This is important because when Natchester gets special summoned to the field, its second effect activates, where when it normal summoned or special summoned, you can target 1 machine monster with 2100 attack or defense points in the graveyard and special summon it to the field. I discarded Cyber Pharaohs, which coincidentally has 2100 defense points, so it gets brought back to the field. Next, I'm using the spell Machine Duplication. This lets me target one machine monster with 500 or less attack on the field, and summon up to 2 copies of that monster from the deck. Normally, this would only be okay if we were summoning up more copies of Natchester. However, remember, Natchester, when it's on the field, isn't called Cyber Dragon Natchester. It's just Cyber Dragon. So, we get to search our deck for 2 copies of Cyber Dragon and special summon them to the field. Next, I activate Galaxy Soldier's effect, which is similar to Natchester's, but it requires me to discard 1 light attribute monster in order to special summon it in face-up defense position. This is a risk because it does have 0 defense points and can be destroyed by 99% of any monster that attacks into it, but we're fine because it's not going to be on the field for long. I discard the other Natchester in my hand and get Galaxy Soldier onto the field, and its secondary effect activates, which lets me get another Galaxy Soldier to my hand. So, now that we have a full field, let's do an Xyz summon. I'm going to take a Cyber Dragon and the Galaxy Soldier to Xyz summon Cyber Dragon Nova, which requires 2 level 5 machine monsters. Next, we're going to perform an Xyz evolution and summon out Cyber Dragon Infinity, using our own Nova and its attached materials. Now, I'm going to normal summon the Galaxy Soldier in my hand by tributing the Natchester on the field, as Galaxy Soldier is level 5. Now, yes, this is my normal summon, because everything up to this point was some form of special summon. That's how good a deck can synergize with itself. Anyway, I activate Cyber Dragon Infinity's ability, which allows it to take 1 monster that's in attack position on the field and equip it to itself as an Xyz material. It then gains an additional 200 attack points and now has more ammo for its other effect to negate and destroy cards. Now here, this is where I fuck up. I got greedy and activate Cyber Pharaohs' ability, which lets me perform a fusion summon using monsters on my field as materials. I fusion summon Chimeritek Overdragon, and forget that one condition of this monster's summoning is that I must destroy all cards on my field, meaning Cyber Dragon Infinity dies for no good reason. Stuff happens, you live and you learn. Obviously, learn from my mistake. One part of dueling is learning to adapt to the current situation. Chimeritek Overdragon here has 2400 attack, because its attack value is determined by the number of monsters used to summon it times 800. I used 3 monsters to summon it, so 3 times 800 equals 2400. I play the Cyber Rev System spell card, which lets me special summon a machine monster to the field from the graveyard, so I choose Cyber Dragon. Quick hindsight, it would have been smarter for me to bring back Natchester, as Natchester's effect would activate, and then I could bring Cyber Dragon back as well. Anyway, I attack Onat directly with the Cyber Dragon and the Chimeritek Overdragon, leaving him with 3,500 life points remaining. I go to the end phase, and Onat begins their turn by drawing a card and playing Xian's Smoke Signal again, which lets them add another 6 Samurai monster to their hand. As if history repeats itself, they summon the same 6 Samurai monster out, which lets them special summon another one from their hand. Then he plays the Cunning of the 6 Samurai, a spell card where they can trade a 6 Samurai monster from their side of the field with one in the graveyard. They bring out 6 Samurai Uru, which then they are able to Xyz summon out Shadow of the 6 Samurai. They destroy the Chimeritek Overdragon and end their turn. Then it comes back to me, and I draw the card that will secure my victory. I play Power Bond, which lets me fusion summon a monster from my extra deck and double its attack points at the cost of taking the original monster's attack as life point damage at the end of my turn. I fuse my Cyber Dragon and Cyber Dragon Natchester in order to bring out my Chimeritek Rampage Dragon, which lets me discard a monster from my deck to the graveyard to attack an additional time. And by discarding my Cyber Dragon Hertz to the graveyard, I activate its effect to add Cyber Dragon Core to my hand. I then have Rampage Dragon attack the Shadow of the 6 Samurai, and then attack directly for game! I kinda got a little out of control there. Pharaoh spirit and all. But that's a duel in a nutshell. Now, if you're overwhelmed by the number of effects going off of one another, don't worry. You're not expected to build a deck like this out of the gate. There's plenty of room to work your way up with to something comfortable, and there's plenty of simpler decks to run that aren't so combo heavy. That's just the kind of style that I like to run. But I hope that the flow of a duel makes a little bit more sense with the phases and the card types in use. With that, we can very quickly go over speed duels. This is the primary type of duel that happens within the game Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. Are you ready for this? It's Yu-Gi-Oh! But small. Yeah, this is a mini form of Master Duel rule set with a smaller field and half the life point value, in duels as well as half the deck size. Duels happen on smaller scales here with 3 monster zones and 3 spell trap card zones, 30 card max for decks and 20 card minimum, and 8 cards possible in the extra deck, as well as the ability to have character-specific abilities that give all sorts of buffs and nerfs across the game. It's different enough that the size of the field and the amount of life points can wildly affect what kind of cards are useful, and decks that aren't so great in Master Duels can find a lot of interesting use in Speed Duels, and vice versa. The final form of dueling at the moment that I'll mention, but won't go too deep into, is Rush Duels. They're sort of a disambiguation off of Speed Duels with some extra rules and the primary duel type used in Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s. There's only a single official way to play this duel style over in the West right now, and that's through the recently released Yu-Gi-Oh! Rush Duel Battle Royale over on Nintendo Switch. I'll be talking about this more next time, so look forward to that. And with that, we are done here. We have covered the anime series, the card types, and now the rules of the game, plus deck building tips, and even an example duel. Next time, we're going to tackle the video games in more depth, so I hope you're excited for that to return. Hope you have a great day, and I'll check you guys next time.